The Harrow family's winter ball was drowning in champagne and lies. When Duke Adrian Blackwell of Ravensmore walked through those gilded doors like death arriving fashionably late, the orchestra stumbled. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every unmarried woman in that ballroom suddenly remembered how to breathe and forgot how to think because the most dangerous man in England had just entered their carefully constructed paradise of silk and scandal. But Adrian Blackwell did not look at the debutantes. He did not acknowledge the mothers practically throwing their daughters at his feet like sacrificial offerings to a pagan god. His pale eyes swept across that crowded room with the detached efficiency of a predator selecting prey, until they landed on the one woman everyone else had already forgotten. Lady Cecilia Harrow stood beside dying white roses looking like she belonged to the furniture. Then the Duke crossed that marble floor and said 5 words that shattered every expectation London had ever held. "She is my only choice." Stay with me through this entire story because you are about to witness what happens when invisibility becomes the most dangerous power a woman can possess. Drop a comment with your city name so I know where in the world you are watching this unfold. Hit that like button if you have ever felt invisible in a room full of people who should have seen you. Cecilia did not believe him at first. She actually thought Adrian Blackwell had made some catastrophic mistake, that he had confused her with one of her younger sisters who possessed the kind of beauty men wrote poetry about. But the Duke stood there watching her with those winter-cold eyes that seemed to catalog every flaw and scar and secret she had spent years trying to hide from the world. Her mother appeared at her elbow within seconds, smelling blood in the water, the way desperate aristocrats always did when sudden opportunity presented itself disguised as salvation. Lady Harrow was the kind of woman who had weaponized charm 3 decades ago and never learned another skill. Age had turned that charm brittle. Desperation had made it dangerous. "Mother," Cecilia said quietly, trying to warn her without words that whatever was happening needed to stop before it became a disaster they could not survive. But Lady Harrow was already performing. "My dear Duke, what an unexpected honor. Though I must confess Cecilia has always been rather reserved at these gatherings. Perhaps you meant to address one of my other daughters." Adrian did not even look at the woman. His attention remained fixed on Cecilia with the focused intensity of a man examining architecture before purchasing it. "I meant exactly what I said." The ballroom had gone silent in that particular way that happens when society senses violence about to occur. Not the physical kind, the social kind. The type of violence that destroyed reputations and ended bloodlines with nothing more than a well-placed rumor or a strategically withdrawn introduction. Cecilia felt the weight of 300 eyes pressing against her skin like hot metal. She had spent 28 years learning how to disappear, how to make herself so unremarkable that her family could pretend she did not exist except when they needed someone to manage the ledgers or smooth over scandal or sacrifice themselves quietly for the sake of appearances. Now Adrian Blackwell was destroying that invisibility with casual precision. She finally found her voice. "Your Grace, I believe there has been some confusion." "There has been no confusion," Adrian said flatly. His voice carried the kind of authority that did not require volume. "I have been watching you for 6 months, Lady Cecilia. I know you manage your family's finances because your father cannot be trusted with basic arithmetic and your brother treats money like water. I know you negotiate with creditors on behalf of your mother, who spends funds she does not possess on parties designed to trap husbands for daughters who do not need them. I know you have been running this household since you were 19 years old, while everyone in this room pretended you were decorative and useless." The silence became suffocating. Cecilia felt something crack open inside her chest, something that felt dangerously close to rage or grief, or maybe just the terrible exhaustion of being seen for the first time by someone who should not have been able to see her at all. "You have been watching me, yes." "Why?" "Because most people in this room are performing roles written by someone else." Adrian's pale eyes never wavered. "You are the only person here who stopped pretending years ago." Her mother made a strangled sound that might have been protest or shock. Cecilia ignored her. She ignored the entire ballroom. For the first time in her adult life, she allowed herself to meet someone's gaze directly, without flinching or apologizing or preparing to disappear. "What exactly do you want, Your Grace?" Adrian Blackwell smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Cecilia had ever witnessed because it contained absolutely no warmth. "I want a duchess capable of surviving Ravensmore. Every other woman in this room would shatter within a month. You have been shattering quietly for years, and you are still standing. That is not a compliment. No, Adrian agreed. It is a qualification. 3 weeks later, Cecilia sat in the Harrow family drawing room listening to her brother Edmund destroy their lives with remarkable efficiency. Edmund was 26 years old and had never encountered a consequence he could not charm or bribe or run away from. He possessed their father's weak jaw and weaker character, combined with their mother's delusional belief that good breeding somehow exempted a person from basic accountability. He stood in front of the fireplace now looking like a child caught stealing sweets, instead of a grown man who had just committed fraud. "What do you mean you forged his signature?" Cecilia said. Her voice came out flat and dead because rage had burned through her so completely there was nothing left except exhausted clarity. Edmund would not meet her eyes. "I thought he would not notice. The debt was relatively small." "Relatively small," Cecilia repeated. "You forged the signature of the Duke of Ravensmore on a promissory note for £8,000, and you thought he would not notice." Their mother sat on the settee making wounded noises like she was the victim in this catastrophe. "Darling, you must understand," Edmund was desperate. "Those gambling debts were threatening to ruin us." "So instead he committed fraud," Cecilia said, "against the one man in England who could destroy our entire family without raising his voice." Edmund finally looked at her and she saw genuine fear there for the first time in years. "You have to fix this, Cece. You always fix things." Cecilia laughed and the sound was sharp enough to draw blood. "I cannot fix fraud, Edmund. This is not a misplaced ledger entry or an accidentally doubled payment. You committed a crime against Adrian Blackwell, the man I am supposed to marry." "Then marry him faster," her mother snapped. "Secure the connection before he discovers what Edmund has done." Cecilia stared at the woman who had birthed her and wondered when exactly she had stopped recognizing her own mother as human. "You want me to trap him. I want you to save this family by lying to the one person who has been honest with me." Her mother stood up, face flushed with indignation and wine. "You have always been selfish, Cecilia, always putting your own feelings ahead of family duty." The words should have hurt. Once upon a time, they would have crushed her. But Cecilia had spent too many years disappearing for the sake of people who never noticed her sacrifice to care anymore what they thought of her refusal to vanish completely. She turned to Edmund. "Who holds the note?" "A man named Caldwell. He operates a lending house near the docks." Edmund's voice had gone small and desperate. "He said if I could not pay within the month, he would go public with it." "Of course he would." Cecilia closed her eyes briefly and did the arithmetic that had become her entire existence. Caldwell specialized in destroying aristocrats. He bought up bad debts and then weaponized them for maximum social damage. Going public with a forged note bearing the Ravensmore seal would not just ruin Edmund. It would obliterate the entire Harrow family and create a scandal large enough to damage even Adrian's carefully controlled reputation. And Adrian would have every right to walk away from all of them. She stood up slowly, feeling centuries older than her 28 years. "I'm going to Ravensmore. I'm going to tell the Duke exactly what you have done. Then I'm going to let him decide whether any of us deserve to survive this." Edmund went pale. "He will destroy us." "Probably," Cecilia agreed, "but at least he will do it honestly." Ravensmore House stood on the northern cliffs like something carved from winter itself. Cecilia had never seen the estate before, and the sight of it stole what little courage she had managed to gather during the carriage ride. The castle rose from black stone worn smooth by centuries of storms, its windows reflecting nothing but gray sky and darker ocean. The cliffs dropped away to violent water far below. Wind screamed through corridors of rock. Everything about the place felt abandoned by warmth. The servant who answered her knock looked surprised to see her. "My lady, we were not expecting you until next month. I need to speak with the Duke immediately." Cecilia stepped inside before she could lose her nerve. "It is urgent." She was led through corridors that smelled like salt and age and sorrow. Portraits lined the walls showing generations of Blackwells staring down with expressions that ranged from stern to actively hostile. None of them smiled. The house itself seemed to disapprove of joy. Adrian found her in the library. He entered without announcement, and Cecilia understood immediately why people feared him. In London, he had seemed dangerous. Here in his own domain, he looked like something that had evolved beyond human weakness into pure disciplined will. He wore no jacket, just shirt sleeves and a waistcoat that emphasized the controlled violence of his posture. Lady Cecilia. His voice gave away nothing. This is unexpected. She stood up too quickly and nearly knocked over a chair. Your Grace, I need to tell you something before we proceed any further with this arrangement. Adrian closed the library door behind him with careful precision. That sounds ominous. Cecilia had prepared a speech during the carriage ride, something diplomatic and carefully worded that might soften the disaster she was about to confess. But standing here in this cold library, looking at the man who had chosen her when no one else bothered to see her, all the careful words disappeared. My brother Edmund forged your signature on a promissory note for £8,000. The debt is held by a man named Caldwell, who specializes in destroying aristocratic families through public scandal. Edmund panicked because of gambling debts and thought forging your name would solve his problems instead of creating worse ones. My mother wants me to marry you quickly and hide this information so the connection to your family might protect us. I am here to tell you the truth because you deserve honesty, even if it means you walk away from all of us. The silence that followed felt like drowning. Adrian did not move, did not speak, just stood there watching her with those pale eyes that seemed to calculate every possible outcome and consequence with terrifying speed. Cecilia forced herself not to look away, not to apologize, not to disappear the way she had trained herself to do whenever conflict appeared. Finally, Adrian spoke. Your brother committed fraud using my name, and your mother wanted you to trap me through marriage to avoid consequences. Yes, and you came here to confess this before I discovered it myself. Yes. Why? The question caught her off guard. Because you chose me when I was invisible. Because you have been honest with me even when honesty was cruel. Because I refuse to become the kind of person who repays integrity with deception. Adrian moved then, crossing the library until he stood close enough that she could see the exact moment something shifted behind his carefully controlled expression. Most people would have hidden this. Most people would have tried to secure the marriage first and dealt with consequences later. I am not most people. No, Adrian agreed quietly. You are not. He turned away from her and walked to the window overlooking the cliffs. Cecilia watched his reflection in the glass and saw something she had not expected to find in the ruthless Duke of Ravensmore. Exhaustion. Caldwell is a vicious opportunist, Adrian said finally. He purchases bad debts from desperate men and then weaponizes them for maximum damage. If he goes public with a forged Ravensmore seal, it will create exactly the kind of scandal he profits from. Your family will be destroyed. My reputation will be damaged, and Edmund will likely face criminal prosecution. I know. Your mother believes marriage to me will somehow protect you from all of that. She is wrong, Cecilia said flatly. You could walk away from this entire disaster and society would applaud you for avoiding contamination. Adrian turned back to face her. Is that what you think I should do? The question felt like a trap, but Cecilia was too tired to navigate around it. I think you should do whatever protects Ravensmore and the people who depend on you. My family has no claim on your mercy. You did not answer my question. Cecilia met his gaze directly. I think you should walk away. I think you should find someone whose family is not collapsing into criminal scandal. I think you should protect yourself because no one else will. And what will you do? Adrian asked quietly, when I walk away. She had not let herself think that far ahead. The future beyond this conversation felt like staring into dark water. Probably marry whoever my mother finds desperate enough to overlook fraud and bankruptcy. Manage the wreckage as long as I can. Disappear again. Return to invisibility. Yes. Adrian crossed back to her in 3 long strides, and Cecilia suddenly understood why people called him dangerous. He stopped close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, could smell winter and stone and something darker underneath. I'm going to tell you something, Lady Cecilia, and I need you to listen carefully. His voice had gone very quiet and very controlled. I rebuilt Ravensmore from ruins left by a father who believed charm was a substitute for character. I watched my mother fade into grief because she married a man who valued appearance over substance. I spent 15 years learning that weakness disguised as kindness destroys everything it touches. So when I say I chose you, I did not choose blindly. I chose the woman who has been managing crisis and carrying weight and surviving collapse while everyone around her performed usefulness. Your brother's fraud does not change that calculation. Cecilia felt something dangerous rising in her throat. You cannot possibly want to marry into this disaster. I do not want disaster, Adrian corrected, but I want you, And unfortunately, you come with family attachments that include a gambling addict and a mother who mistakes manipulation for strategy. They stared at each other across 3 feet of library floor, and Cecilia felt the entire trajectory of her life hanging in the balance of whatever happened next. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I am saying I will handle Caldwell." Adrian's expression had gone cold and calculating again. "I will purchase the forged note before he can weaponize it. I will force your brother into genuine accountability instead of letting him run from consequences again. And I will marry you exactly as planned because nothing about this changes what I already knew to be true." Which is what? That you are the only person in your entire family worth saving. The words should have felt like victory. Instead, they felt like standing on the edge of those violent cliffs outside, wondering whether the fall would kill her or just break enough bones to make survival worse than death. "My family will expect you to protect them," Cecilia said carefully. "My mother will see your intervention as proof that she can continue avoiding consequences. Edmund will learn nothing except that someone else will always clean up his disasters." Adrian smiled again with that terrible absence of warmth. "Then your family will be disappointed." "I am not protecting them, Lady Cecilia. I am protecting you." "There's a significant difference. And if I refuse you after all of this," the question hung between them like a blade. Adrian did not flinch. "Then I walk away exactly as you suggested and your family faces consequences without my interference. But you will have made that choice freely instead of being cornered into it by your brother's criminality." Cecilia felt tears burning behind her eyes and refused to let them fall. "Why are you doing this?" "Because mercy without conditions becomes permission for repeated harm," Adrian said. "And because you deserve the freedom to choose instead of being trapped by circumstances created by people who have never valued your sacrifice." He turned toward the library door and Cecilia heard herself speak before she could stop the words. "I do not know how to be chosen." Adrian looked back at her, and for the first time she saw something almost gentle in those winter eyes. "Then we will learn together." Bon? The confrontation happened 3 days later in the Harrow drawing room, and it was the most terrifying thing Cecilia had ever witnessed. Adrian Blackwell walked into that space, like judgment arriving in human form. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply existed with such controlled intensity that the entire room seemed to shrink around him. Edmund tried to run. "Sit down," Adrian said quietly, and Edmund sat. Lady Harrow attempted charm. "Your Grace, I am certain we can discuss this unfortunate misunderstanding in a civilized manner." "There is no misunderstanding," Adrian replied without looking at her. "Your son committed fraud. The only question is whether he faces consequences privately or publicly." Edmund had gone the color of spoiled milk. "I did not mean to cause trouble, Your Grace. I was desperate." "Desperation explains," Adrian said. "It does not absolve." He produced the forged promissory note from his jacket and placed it on the table between them like evidence at a trial. "I purchased this from Caldwell for £12,000, 4,000 more than the original debt because the man understands the value of leverage. The note is now void. Edmund's forgery will not become public scandal." Lady Harrow made a sound of relief. "Oh, thank heavens, Your Grace. We are so grateful." "You should not be," Adrian said coldly, "because Edmund is going to repay every penny of that £12,000 through labor at Ravensmore. He will work in the estate offices learning actual accountability. He will live on the grounds under supervision. He will have no access to gambling establishments or his London friends who enabled this disaster. And if he attempts to run or fails to meet these conditions, I will prosecute him for fraud personally." Edmund looked like he might vomit. "That is slavery. That is consequences," Adrian corrected. "You have 2 choices. Accept these terms or face criminal prosecution. Decide now." The room held its breath. Edmund looked at his mother desperately, but Lady Harrow had finally encountered a situation her charm could not solve. He looked at Cecilia, and she stared back at him with absolutely no sympathy because she had spent years cleaning up his disasters, and she was done. "I accept," Edmund whispered. "Good." Adrian turned to Lady Harrow. "As for you, madam, you will cease all contact with Cecilia beyond basic courtesy. You will not ask her for money. You will not involve her in family schemes. You will not attempt to use her connection to me for social advantage. If you violate any of these conditions, I will withdraw all financial support from this household immediately." Lady Harrow's face went through several interesting colors. You cannot dictate how I interact with my own daughter. Watch me, Adrian said flatly. He looked at Cecilia then, and she saw the question in his eyes. She could stop this. She could ask him to soften the terms, to give her family more chances, to protect them from the full weight of their own consequences. Instead, she nodded once. Adrian turned back to Edmund and Lady Harrow. You have 48 hours to prepare. Edmund will report to Ravensmore on Monday morning. These terms are not negotiable. Then he walked out of that drawing room like the conquering force he was, leaving chaos and consequences behind him. Cecilia followed him into the hallway. She did not know what she was going to say until the words came out. Thank you. Adrian stopped. Do not thank me for basic decency. You gave him a chance to learn instead of just destroying him. I gave him the consequences his actions demanded, Adrian corrected. Whether he learns from them is his choice, but at least now someone is holding him accountable instead of enabling him to destruction. They stood in that narrow hallway, and Cecilia finally understood what she was committing to by marrying this man. Adrian Blackwell would never be soft. He would never pretend consequences did not exist for the sake of comfort. He would demand accountability from everyone around him, including her. And somehow that felt safer than a lifetime of living with people who avoided truth. I am ready, she said quietly, to marry you, to face whatever comes next, to stop disappearing. Adrian watched her for a long moment. Then he reached out and touched her face with surprising gentleness. Good. Because Ravensmore needs a duchess who refuses to shatter. What if I shatter anyway? Then I will be there when you do. The words should not have mattered as much as they did. But Cecilia had spent so many years holding herself together alone that the promise of witness felt revolutionary. They set the wedding date for 6 weeks later, and Cecilia spent those weeks discovering that choosing herself felt more dangerous than any sacrifice ever had. But London was not finished with them yet. Caldwell had taken Adrian's money, but he had not forgotten the humiliation of being outmaneuvered. 3 weeks before the wedding, whispers began circulating through aristocratic circles. Quiet rumors at first. Suggestions that the Duke of Ravensmore was not quite as honorable as his reputation suggested. Questions about the child living at the estate. Speculation about what kind of woman would marry into such darkness. The rumors grew teeth. Someone started suggesting that Eliza was not Adrian's orphan niece but his illegitimate daughter. That Ravensmore was a house of secrets and sin. That Cecilia Harrow was either desperate enough or complicit enough to overlook moral corruption for the sake of a title. Then the parliamentary faction that hated Adrian's political influence began weaponizing the gossip. Cecilia watched it happen with the cold clarity of someone who had survived London society long enough to recognize orchestrated destruction when she saw it. This was not random scandal. This was coordinated attack designed to damage Adrian's reputation and political power through his upcoming marriage. She confronted him about it in the Ravensmore library where this entire strange journey had begun. They're trying to destroy you through me, she said without preamble. If you postpone the wedding, the scandal dies down. If you proceed, it gets worse. Adrian looked up from correspondence he had been reviewing. So you want me to abandon you to protect my reputation? I want you to make the strategic choice. The strategic choice, Adrian repeated slowly, would be to throw you to the wolves and find a bride whose family is not collapsing into public disaster. Yes. He stood up and crossed to where she stood near the window. The late afternoon light turned his pale eyes nearly colorless. Let me be very clear about something, Lady Cecilia. I do not make decisions based on fear of gossip. I do not abandon people because protecting them becomes inconvenient. And I certainly do not let men like Caldwell dictate my choices. They are destroying your political influence. Let them try. Adrian's voice had gone very quiet and very dangerous. I have spent 15 years building Ravensmore into something no scandal can touch. My wealth is independent. My estates are profitable. My political enemies fear me because I do not require their approval to survive. The only power they have is the power I give them through caring what they think. And Eliza, Cecilia pressed, the rumors about her are vicious, which is why I am going to end them. How? By introducing her to London society as my niece and ward, with you standing beside us as my duchess. Adrian moved closer. By making it clear that anyone who spreads lies about an 8-year-old child will face my direct and permanent opposition. By showing them that Ravensmore does not hide in shadows anymore. Cecilia stared at him. That could backfire spectacularly. It could, Adrian agreed. Or it could demonstrate that the people who matter most to me are worth defending regardless of consequences. You are gambling your entire reputation on this. No, Adrian said quietly. I'm refusing to let fear dictate my life anymore. There is a difference. The words hit Cecilia harder than she expected, because she had spent her entire existence letting fear dictate every choice. Fear of disappointing her family. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of taking up space. Fear of being seen. Adrian was offering her something more dangerous than safety. He was offering her freedom. But freedom required courage she was not certain she possessed. What if I am not strong enough for this? She whispered. Adrian reached out and took her hand in his. It was the first time he had touched her with genuine tenderness instead of calculated formality. Then you break and we rebuild. But you do not disappear. Not anymore. Not ever again. Cecilia felt something crack wide open inside her chest, something that had been holding her together through sheer stubborn will for longer than she could remember. She was so tired of being invisible, so tired of sacrificing herself for people who never noticed, so tired of pretending she did not deserve to be chosen. I am terrified, she admitted. Good, Adrian said. That means you are finally fighting for something that matters. The wedding happened exactly as scheduled. And 3 days before Cecilia was supposed to become the Duchess of Ravensmore, a letter arrived that changed everything. It was addressed to Adrian in handwriting she did not recognize. He read it standing in the morning room while Cecilia watched his expression transform from controlled calm into something she had never seen before. Rage. Pure, controlled, devastating rage. What is it? She asked. Adrian handed her the letter without speaking. The words blurred at first, then came into sharp, brutal focus. It was from Caldwell, a final threat. He claimed to have evidence that Eliza was indeed Adrian's illegitimate child. He threatened to publish that evidence unless Adrian paid him £50,000. It was blackmail built on lies, but the threat was real enough to destroy everything. Cecilia looked up from the letter. This is my family's fault. If Edmund had not forged that note, Caldwell would never have had leverage to begin with. This is Caldwell's fault, Adrian corrected coldly. For being a parasite who profits from other people's pain. What are you going to do? Adrian's smile was terrifying. I am going to end him. Then he walked out of the morning room, and Cecilia understood she had just witnessed the moment the ruthless Duke of Ravensmore stopped showing mercy. And she had absolutely no idea whether she should stop him or stand beside him while he burned London to the ground. Adrian Blackwell did not believe in half measures. Cecilia learned this, watching him dismantle Caldwell's entire operation with the surgical precision of a man who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of war. He did not rage. He did not threaten. He simply activated a network of contacts, investigators, and legal professionals who operated with the quiet efficiency of soldiers executing orders they had drilled 1,000 times before. Within 48 hours, Adrian knew everything. Caldwell's lending house was built on a foundation of fraud and extortion. The man purchased debts from desperate aristocrats, then manufactured additional scandal to increase leverage. He had destroyed at least 7 families over the past decade, driving 2 men to suicide and 3 women into marriages that resembled legalized slavery. And he had never faced consequences because his victims were too terrified or too ashamed to fight back. Adrian was neither. The Duke of Ravensmore had built his reputation on understanding that power without accountability was just violence wearing expensive clothes, and he had no intention of letting a parasite like Caldwell continue profiting from human desperation. But the strategy he chose was not the one Cecilia expected. They sat in his study at Ravensmore while rain hammered against windows that overlooked the violent cliffs. Adrian spread documents across the desk with methodical care, each page representing another piece of evidence he had gathered against Caldwell's operation. You could destroy him publicly, Cecilia said, studying the financial records that proved systematic fraud. You have enough evidence to send him to prison. Adrian looked up from the papers. I could, but public trials create spectacle. Spectacle creates attention, and attention puts Eliza in the center of gossip I refuse to subject her to. So what is the alternative? Complete annihilation without audience. The words should have sounded dramatic, but Adrian delivered them with the flat certainty of someone describing weather. Cecilia felt something cold slide down her spine because she was finally witnessing the full scope of what the ruthless Duke of Ravensmore looked like when he stopped playing by society's rules. Explain, she said quietly. Adrian stood and walked to the window where rain obscured the ocean into gray nothing. Caldwell's lending operation depends on three things: access to desperate aristocrats who need money, a reputation for discretion that makes people trust him with secrets, and protection from legal consequences through carefully maintained relationships with corrupt officials. If I remove all three simultaneously, his entire structure collapses. How do you remove all three? Adrian turned back to face her, and his expression was absolutely calm. I have purchased every debt Caldwell currently holds through intermediaries he cannot trace back to me. As of this morning, he has no inventory. I have also ensured that certain information about his fraud reaches the right investigators who cannot be bribed or intimidated. And I have made it clear to every aristocrat in London that anyone who does business with Caldwell after this week will find themselves excluded from Ravensmore's political and social influence permanently. Cecilia stared at him. You are destroying his business, his reputation, and his legal protection all at once. Yes. That is not mercy. No, Adrian agreed. That is consequences. There is a difference. She wanted to argue with him, wanted to suggest that maybe complete destruction was excessive, but the words died in her throat because she kept thinking about Edmund. Her brother had committed fraud, and Adrian had given him accountability with conditions. Caldwell had spent a decade destroying families for profit, and Adrian was giving him exactly what he had earned. This was not cruelty. This was a man who understood that sometimes mercy directed at predators was just betrayal of their victims. When does this happen? Cecilia asked. It already has. Adrian's voice was very quiet. Caldwell woke up this morning to discover his business no longer exists. By tomorrow, he will understand that his threats have no power. And within the week, he will leave London permanently or face prosecution he cannot escape. You planned this before he even sent that blackmail letter. I planned this the moment I purchased Edmund's forged note, Adrian corrected. Caldwell was always going to escalate. Men like him always do. I simply prepared for inevitability. Cecilia felt something shift inside her chest, some fundamental understanding about the man she was about to marry. Adrian Blackwell was not cruel, but he was absolutely ruthless. He did not enjoy destruction, but he did not hesitate to deliver it when necessary. And he drew a line between protecting people who made mistakes and protecting predators who weaponized those mistakes. The question was whether she could live with that distinction, or whether she wanted to. What if you are wrong about him, she said carefully. What if Caldwell was just desperate himself? Adrian's expression went very cold. I have interviewed 4 women whose husbands killed themselves after Caldwell destroyed them. I have documentation of him deliberately manufacturing scandal to increase debt leverage. I have proof he threatened to expose a 15-year-old girl's private correspondence unless her father paid triple the original loan. Caldwell is not desperate. He is a predator who has weaponized other people's desperation for profit. The room went silent except for rain against glass. Cecilia thought about her mother, who had tried to manipulate Adrian into protecting her from consequences. She thought about Edmund, who had committed fraud and expected someone else to fix it. She thought about herself spending years disappearing so other people could avoid accountability. And she realized Adrian was offering her something more dangerous than protection. He was offering her a world where actions had consequences, even when those consequences were uncomfortable. I am not certain I am strong enough for this, she admitted. Adrian crossed back to the desk and looked at her with those pale winter eyes that seemed to see through every defense she had ever built. You spent 28 years holding together a family that should have collapsed a decade ago. You walked into this house and confessed your brother's fraud when lying would have been easier. You chose honesty over safety. You're stronger than you believe, Cecilia. You simply learned to mistake survival for weakness. The words hit harder than they should have, because Cecilia had spent her entire life apologizing for existing, for taking up space, for having needs or desires or opinions that might inconvenience the people around her. She had made herself so small that even she had stopped noticing when she disappeared. And Adrian Blackwell was telling her that invisibility was not the same as weakness. The wedding is in 3 days, she said quietly. Are you certain you want to marry someone who comes with this much chaos? Adrian smiled, and it was still terrifying, but there was something almost gentle underneath it now. I am marrying you because of the chaos, not despite it. Any woman can manage a peaceful household. I need a duchess who can survive storms. What if I bring the storms with me? Then we will weather them together. He said it like a fact instead of a promise, and somehow that made it more believable. Cecilia took a breath that felt like drowning and made a choice that terrified her more than any sacrifice ever had. Then I will stand beside you when you destroy Caldwell, when London whispers, when your enemies attack. I will not disappear. Good, Adrian said, because Ravensmore needs a duchess who refuses to run. 3 days later, Cecilia Harrow became the Duchess of Ravensmore in a ceremony that felt more like a declaration of war than a wedding. Mumpshatu. London society attended the wedding like vultures circling a fresh carcass. They came dressed in silk and judgment, filling the chapel with whispered speculation about how long the marriage would last before scandal or misery destroyed it. The betting books at the clubs had already started taking wagers. 3 months was the popular estimate. 6 if the Duke was more patient than his reputation suggested. Cecilia walked down that aisle feeling 300 pairs of eyes dissecting every step. Her dress was ivory silk that cost more than her family's annual income, custom made by a French modiste who understood that elegance was not the same as decoration. Her hair was swept back in a style that emphasized the sharp intelligence of her face instead of hiding it. She wore the Ravensmore diamonds at her throat like armor, and she did not look at the crowd. She looked only at Adrian standing at the altar, watching her approach with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing to the gossips around them, but everything to her. He was not smiling. He rarely smiled, but his eyes tracked her movement with the focused intensity of a man who had chosen exactly what he wanted and refused to question that choice. When she reached him, he offered his hand. She took it. The vicar began the ceremony, and Cecilia barely heard the words because her entire awareness had narrowed to the feeling of Adrian's hand holding hers. His grip was firm, but not possessive, present, but not controlling. It felt like standing on solid ground after years of drowning. The vows should have felt performative. Instead, they felt like drawing a line in the sand and daring the world to cross it. When Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt the weight of it, like a brand. Not ownership. Consequence. She was choosing this. Choosing him. Choosing to stop disappearing. And that choice terrified her more than any sacrifice ever had because she could not unmake it. The vicar pronounced them married. Adrian kissed her, and it was nothing like the romantic fantasies she had abandoned years ago. It was brief and controlled and absolutely deliberate. A public claim witnessed by everyone who had spent the morning betting on their failure. Then they walked back down that aisle together as Duke and Duchess of Ravensmore, while London whispered poison and doubt. But Cecilia did not disappear. She held her head up and met the eyes of every person who had ignored her for 28 years. She let them see her, let them judge, let them whisper, because she was done making herself small for their comfort. The breakfast reception afterward was worse. Society descended on Ravensmore House like an invading army disguised as well-wishers. They filled the ballrooms with false congratulations and barely concealed speculation. Every conversation was a trap designed to extract information or create scandal. Lady Pemberton cornered Cecilia near the champagne with a smile sharp enough to draw blood. "My dear Duchess, what a surprise this all is. We had quite given up on you ever marrying." Cecilia had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing from conversations like this. But she was done disappearing. Had you? "Well, you must admit you were rather on the shelf," Lady Pemberton continued. 28 is quite advanced for a first marriage. I prefer to think of it as selective, Cecilia replied calmly. I was waiting for someone worth choosing. The smile on Lady Pemberton's face went brittle. How fortunate the Duke was desperate enough to notice you. The insult was designed to wound, but Cecilia had survived 28 years of her own mother's cutting remarks. She met Lady Pemberton's eyes directly. Desperation had nothing to do with it. But please do continue speculating. I understand betting on other people's failures is quite popular this season. She walked away before the woman could respond. Adrian found her moments later near the windows overlooking the cliffs. You are making enemies. I am refusing to be invisible, Cecilia corrected. Apparently those are the same thing. He almost smiled. Good. Let them see who you actually are instead of who they assumed you to be. And who am I? Someone strong enough to survive standing beside me. The words should have sounded arrogant, but Adrian delivered them with the flat honesty that was starting to feel like the most reliable thing in Cecilia's world. He did not lie. He did not perform. He simply existed with absolute clarity about who he was and what he demanded from the people around him. It was terrifying. It was also the safest she had felt in years. The reception lasted 4 more hours of smiling through poison and deflecting attacks disguised as conversation. By the time the last guest finally left, Cecilia felt like she had survived a battle instead of a party. Adrian found her in the library where this entire strange journey had begun. She was standing by the window watching storms gather over the ocean. The sky had gone dark and violent. Rain would arrive within the hour. Everything about the view felt like a warning. "You handled them well," Adrian said from the doorway. "I survived them," Cecilia corrected without turning around. "That is not the same as handling them well." He crossed the room until he stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, far enough that she did not feel trapped. "Do you regret this?" The question was so direct it stole her breath. Cecilia thought about the wedding, about the gossip, about the fact that she had just legally bound herself to the most dangerous man in England, about how her entire future now depended on whether she could survive the storms that came with choosing visibility over safety. "I do not know yet," she admitted. "Ask me again in 6 months." "Fair enough." They stood together in silence while darkness gathered outside, and Cecilia wondered whether she had just made the bravest choice of her life or the most catastrophic mistake. Then Adrian spoke again. "I need to tell you something before we go any further. That sounds ominous." "It is honest," he corrected, "which is worse." Cecilia turned to face him fully. "Tell me." Adrian's expression was absolutely controlled, but she was learning to read the tension underneath it. "Eliza is not adjusting well to the idea of you. She has spent 8 years learning that every woman I bring into this house will eventually hurt her or abandon her. She does not trust that you will be different. Have you brought many women into this house?" "None," Adrian said flatly. "But her mother did, before she died. A series of governesses and caretakers who treated Eliza like an inconvenience or a stain on the family reputation. The child learned early that women in positions of authority over her cannot be trusted." Cecilia felt something crack in her chest. How did her mother die? "Fever when Eliza was 3. Adrian's voice had gone very quiet. "My sister married a man our father approved of because he had a title and no debts. The man was charming in public and vicious in private. My sister endured 5 years of a marriage that resembled captivity before illness took her. And Eliza has spent the last 5 years being raised by staff who pity her but do not love her." "And you," Cecilia said carefully, "do you love her?" Adrian met her eyes directly. "Yes, which is why I need you to understand that if you hurt that child, I will never forgive you." The threat was delivered without heat, but it landed like a blade. Cecilia had expected many things from this marriage: danger, difficulty, political enemies. She had not expected to be measured against an 8-year-old girl's broken trust. "I would never hurt a child," she said. "Everyone says that," Adrian replied. "Then they do it anyway through neglect or cruelty disguised as discipline or simple indifference." "Then let me be clear." Cecilia stepped closer until they were separated by inches instead of feet. "I spent my entire childhood being treated like an inconvenience by my own mother. I know exactly what it feels like to be invisible in your own home. I will not do that to Eliza. Ever." Adrian studied her face like he was searching for lies. "What will you do instead?" "I will let her decide whether she wants me in her life," Cecilia said. "I will not force affection or demand trust she has not chosen to give. And I will be there when she is ready. If she is ever ready, and if she is never ready, then I will love her from a distance without making it her burden to carry." Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Not softness, exactly, but maybe the beginning of trust. "You mean that?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because invisibility is lonely," Cecilia said quietly, "and I refuse to make another person feel that way if I can prevent it." They stared at each other across the space between them, and Cecilia understood she had just been tested, not cruelly, but thoroughly. Adrian needed to know she understood that his first loyalty would always be protecting the child who had already survived too much damage. And Cecilia needed him to understand she had no intention of competing for his attention by hurting someone smaller than herself. "When do I meet her?" Cecilia asked. "Tomorrow," Adrian said. "She has been avoiding the wedding chaos, but she needs to understand you are permanent now. What if she hates me? Then we will deal with that honestly instead of pretending everything is fine." Cecilia took a breath that felt like drowning. "You do not make anything easy." "No," Adrian agreed. "But I make things honest, and honest is safer than easy." He was right, but that did not make it less terrifying. Hook. Eliza Blackwell was 8 years old and looked like she had been carved from winter itself. Cecilia met her the next morning in the conservatory, where pale sunlight filtered through glass that overlooked the cliffs. The child sat on a bench surrounded by plants that should not survive this far north, but thrived anyway through sheer stubborn defiance. She did not look up when Cecilia entered. "Hello, Eliza," Cecilia said quietly. "I am Cecilia. I know who you are." The child's voice was flat and hostile. "You married Uncle Adrian yesterday. The whole house has been talking about nothing else for weeks." Cecilia sat down on a bench across from the girl, careful to maintain distance. I imagine that was disruptive. Eliza finally looked up, and Cecilia felt her heart crack because the child had Adrian's pale eyes, but none of his controlled confidence. She looked like someone who had learned early that hoping for good things was just preparation for disappointment. "Are you going to pretend to like me?" Eliza asked bluntly. "Or can we skip that part?" The question was so direct it surprised a laugh out of Cecilia. "I would prefer to skip it. Pretending is exhausting." "Good." Eliza turned her attention back to the plant she had been studying. "Most adults lie constantly." "Do they?" "Yes. They say things they do not mean because they think children are too stupid to notice the difference." Cecilia considered this. What kind of things? That they care. That they will stay. That I matter. The words were delivered without emotion, but they landed like blows. Cecilia felt rage rising in her throat for every adult who had taught this child that affection was just performance before abandonment. "I am not going to tell you I care about you," Cecilia said carefully, "because we just met and caring requires knowing someone. But I will tell you that I have no intention of hurting you or abandoning you or treating you like you are invisible." "Why should I believe you?" "Because I spent 28 years being invisible in my own family," Cecilia replied. "And I hated every moment of it. I would not do that to someone else." Eliza watched her with those pale eyes that were far too old for 8. "Uncle Adrian says you are strong. Your uncle has higher expectations than I deserve." "He never lies," Eliza said. "If he says you are strong, then you probably are." Cecilia felt something dangerous rising in her chest because this child trusted Adrian absolutely, and that trust was the most fragile thing Cecilia had ever witnessed. "What else does your uncle say about me? That you chose him when you could have walked away? That you told him the truth when lying would have been easier? That you are the first person he has met in years who does not want something from him? Is that unusual?" "Everyone wants something from Uncle Adrian," Eliza said. "Money or protection or favors or just the ability to say they know the Duke of Ravensmore. You are the first person who told him no." "I told him no several times," Cecilia corrected. "He is extremely persistent." Eliza almost smiled, and it transformed her entire face from hostile stranger into someone who might eventually become human. "He says that is your best quality, that you do not surrender easily." They sat in silence while morning light shifted across glass and stone. Cecilia did not try to force conversation or connection. She simply existed in the same space as this broken child and let her choose whether that space felt safe or dangerous. Finally, Eliza spoke again. "Are you going to make Uncle Adrian stop spending time with me now that you are married?" The question revealed everything. This child had been abandoned by everyone who should have protected her. She had learned that adult relationships meant children became inconvenient obstacles to be removed or ignored. And she was terrified Adrian's marriage would mean losing the one person who had chosen to love her. Cecilia felt tears burning behind her eyes and refused to let them fall. "No. I am not going to make your uncle choose between us. And if he tried to abandon you for my sake, I would leave him immediately." Eliza stared at her. "You mean that?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because adults who hurt children to make their own lives easier are cowards," Cecilia said bluntly, "and I refuse to be a coward." The child studied her face for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "Okay. Okay, what?" "Okay, you can stay. But I'm going to watch you. And if you hurt Uncle Adrian or lie to him or try to make him send me away, I will make your life miserable." The threat should have been ridiculous coming from an 8-year-old. Instead, it was the most honest thing anyone had said to Cecilia since the wedding. "Fair enough," she replied. "I would expect nothing less." Eliza almost smiled again. "Uncle Adrian said you would say that, did he?" "Yes. He said you were the first person he had met who did not mistake kindness for weakness or honesty for cruelty." Cecilia felt something dangerous shifting in her chest, because Adrian had apparently spent months studying her before approaching her at that ball. He had known her better than she knew herself, and now she was legally bound to a man who saw through every defense she had ever built. "Your uncle is terrifying," Cecilia said. "Yes," Eliza agreed, "but he is also safe." Once you understand the difference between dangerous and unsafe, Uncle Adrian makes sense. The words were far too wise for 8 years old. Cecilia spent the next hour simply sitting with Eliza in the conservatory while the child talked about plants and storms and all the ways adults disappointed her. She did not ask for affection, did not demand trust, just listened. And when Adrian found them later, Eliza was showing Cecilia how to identify which plants were poisonous by examining leaf structure. It was the strangest beginning to a family Cecilia had ever witnessed. But it was honest, and honest was starting to feel more important than easy. The first real test came 3 weeks later when Parliament reconvened and Adrian's political enemies finally made their move. Cecilia was reading correspondence in the morning room when Adrian entered, looking like controlled violence wrapped in expensive tailoring. She had learned to recognize that particular expression. It meant someone had miscalculated badly and was about to discover exactly how ruthless the Duke of Ravensmore could become. "What happened?" she asked without preamble. Lord Ashford introduced a motion questioning the legitimacy of my guardianship over Eliza. Adrian's voice was flat and cold. "He is claiming I am unfit to raise a child because of moral corruption and suggesting the girl should be removed from Ravensmore and placed with more suitable family members." Cecilia felt ice sliding down her spine. "He is using Eliza to attack you politically." "Yes." "Who are these suitable family members?" "Ashford's sister, who coincidentally married into a family that has been trying to undermine my political influence for the past 5 years. So this has nothing to do with Eliza's welfare. This has everything to do with destroying my reputation and gaining leverage over Ravensmore's political power," Adrian corrected. "Eliza is just the weapon they chose to use." Cecilia stood up slowly. "What are you going to do?" Adrian's smile was terrifying. "I am going to remind Lord Ashford why people fear me." "That sounds like a threat." "It is a promise." He turned to leave, and Cecilia heard herself speak before she could stop the words. "Wait." Adrian paused in the doorway. Cecilia crossed the room until she stood close enough to see the absolute fury burning behind his controlled expression. She had never witnessed him this angry, had never seen him this close to losing the iron discipline that ruled every aspect of his existence. And she realized this was the moment that would define everything. She could ask him to be careful, could beg him not to escalate, could try to soften the consequences he was about to deliver, or she could stand beside him and refuse to flinch. "Destroy him," she said quietly. "Make Lord Ashford regret he ever heard the name Blackwell." Adrian stared at her. "You understand what that means. If I move against him publicly, it will create scandal. It will damage relationships. It will make enemies." "Good," Cecilia replied. "Let them see what happens when someone tries to hurt a child to score political points." Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Not quite softness, but recognition. "You are certain?" "I am furious," Cecilia corrected. "That man is trying to tear an 8-year-old girl away from the only person who loves her just to gain political leverage. I want him destroyed." Adrian crossed back to her in 2 strides and kissed her. It was nothing like the controlled kiss at their wedding. This was fierce and claiming, and absolutely honest. He kissed her like she had just proven herself in some fundamental way he had been waiting to witness. When he pulled back, his eyes were still cold, but there was something almost gentle underneath. "You are exactly who I thought you were. Terrifying. Strong," he corrected, and finally willing to stop hiding it. Then he left to dismantle Lord Ashford's entire political career with surgical precision. And Cecilia stood in that morning room understanding she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. She was no longer the invisible daughter who disappeared to keep peace. She was the Duchess of Ravensmore, and Ravensmore did not forgive attacks on its own. Adrian's counterattack was devastating in its efficiency. Within 48 hours, every member of Parliament knew the truth about Lord Ashford's finances. The man was drowning in debt. He had been accepting bribes from foreign interests. His sister's husband was involved in a fraud scheme that made Edmund's forgery look like amateur hour. Adrian did not need to make speeches or public accusations. He simply ensured the right information reached the right investigators. And Lord Ashford's motion regarding Eliza's guardianship died before it ever reached a vote. But the damage was done. London society now knew that attacking the Duke of Ravensmore's family would result in complete annihilation. No mercy, no negotiation, just consequences delivered with terrifying precision. And Cecilia had stood beside him through all of it. She attended parliamentary sessions where wives rarely ventured. She met with political allies and made it clear that any attack on Eliza would be met with unified opposition. She transformed herself from invisible wallflower into a duchess who refused to be ignored. It was exhausting. It was also the most alive she had ever felt. One evening, 3 weeks after the Ashford disaster finally settled, Cecilia found Adrian in his study reviewing correspondence. He looked up when she entered and she saw the exhaustion underneath his controlled expression. "You should rest," she said. "So should you." "I cannot." Cecilia crossed to the window where rain battered glass. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Lord Ashford's face when he realized you had destroyed him. Does that bother you?" The question made her turn back to face him. "It should. I should feel guilty that we ruined a man's entire career, but you do not." "No," Cecilia admitted. "I feel satisfied. And that terrifies me." Adrian stood and crossed to where she stood. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because I spent my entire life avoiding conflict, making myself smaller so other people would not feel threatened. And now I am standing beside you while you destroy your enemies, and I do not feel guilty. I feel powerful. What does that make me?" "Human," Adrian said quietly. "You are not a monster for refusing to let someone hurt a child without consequences, Cecilia. You are simply someone who finally stopped mistaking passivity for virtue." The words landed like absolution she had not known she needed. Cecilia looked at this man she had married, this dangerous duke who saw her more clearly than anyone ever had, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not love exactly, not yet, but something that felt like the foundation love could eventually build on. "I do not know how to be this person," she admitted. "This duchess who stands beside you and does not flinch." "Then we learn together," Adrian replied. "The same way we learn everything else. By surviving storms. By refusing to run from them." They stood together in that study while rain screamed against stone, and Cecilia understood she had finally found something more dangerous than invisibility. She had found purpose. And purpose demanded she stop apologizing for taking up space in a world that had spent 28 years trying to erase her. But London was not finished testing them yet. 2 months after the wedding, rumors began circulating that Cecilia was expecting a child. The whispers started in drawing rooms and spread through ballrooms with the infectious speed of truly malicious gossip. Some claimed she had trapped the Duke through pregnancy. Others suggested the child was not his. A few particularly vicious rumors implied she had been pregnant before the wedding. None of it was true. Cecilia was not pregnant. But the damage of the rumors was spreading faster than truth could contain it. She confronted Adrian about it in the library where so many of their crucial conversations seemed to happen. He was reviewing financial reports when she entered, and she could tell from his expression that he had already heard the gossip. "They are saying I am pregnant," she said without preamble. "They are implying I trapped you, so I know. Does it bother you?" Adrian looked up from the reports. "Does it bother you?" Cecilia felt rage rising in her throat. "Yes. It bothers me that I cannot exist as your wife without London inventing scandal to explain it. It bothers me that every choice I make is examined for evidence of manipulation or deception. It bothers me that I am apparently not allowed to simply be chosen without some sinister reason behind it." "Then we address it directly," Adrian said. "How?" "By making it clear that you are my duchess because I chose you. Not because you trapped me. Not because of scandal or pregnancy or any other explanation London prefers to the truth." "And how do we make that clear?" "By refusing to hide," Adrian replied. "By attending every social function together. By making it obvious that I value you and trust you and have no regrets about this marriage. By showing them that their gossip has no power over us." Cecilia stared at him. "You want to fight rumors by being publicly affectionate." "I want to fight rumors by being publicly honest," Adrian corrected. "Affection is irrelevant. Respect is not." The distinction mattered, because London expected the Duke of Ravensmore to be cold and distant with his wife. They expected him to treat her like decoration or obligation. Public respect would be more shocking than any declaration of love. "What if it does not work?" Cecilia asked. "What if the rumors just get worse?" "Then we survive them anyway," Adrian said. "The same way we survive everything else, by refusing to give gossip more power than truth." He made it sound simple. It was not simple, But Cecilia was learning that nothing about being the Duchess of Ravensmore would ever be easy. The question was whether she was strong enough to survive difficulty without disappearing. She met Adrian's pale eyes across the library and made another choice that terrified her. Then let them watch. Let them see that I am not ashamed of being chosen. Let them see that you do not regret choosing me. Good, Adrian said, because I do not. The words should not have mattered as much as they did. But Cecilia had spent so many years believing she was unworthy of being chosen that hearing Adrian state the opposite with absolute certainty felt revolutionary. They attended the Pemberton Ball that weekend, and Cecilia walked into that ballroom on Adrian's arm feeling like she was marching into battle instead of a social function. Every eye in the room tracked their entrance. Every conversation paused. The gossip had reached fever pitch over the past week, and London was waiting eagerly to see how the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmore would handle the scandal. Adrian did not give them the drama they expected. He simply existed beside Cecilia with absolute confidence. He introduced her to political allies with genuine respect. He deferred to her opinion on social matters. He made it clear through every word and gesture that she was not decoration or obligation, but an equal partner in managing Ravensmore's influence. And slowly the gossip started losing power. Because it is difficult to maintain rumors about a woman being manipulative or deceitful when her husband treats her like someone whose judgment he trusts completely. Lady Pemberton cornered them near the champagne with that sharp smile that promised bloodshed. Your Grace, you are looking well. The rumors of your condition seem to have been exaggerated. There is no condition to exaggerate, Cecilia replied calmly, but I appreciate your concern. Of course, Lady Pemberton's smile went brittle. Though one does wonder why such rumors would start without some foundation. One wonders why some people need to invent scandal instead of accepting that a marriage can simply be what it appears to be, Adrian said coldly. But perhaps you have insight into that particular pathology, Lady Pemberton. The woman went pale. Adrian guided Cecilia away before she could respond, and Cecilia felt something dangerous rising in her chest. That was vicious. That was necessary, Adrian corrected. People like Lady Pemberton only understand direct consequences. Politeness just encourages further attack. You're teaching me to be ruthless. I am teaching you to stop apologizing for existing, Adrian replied. There is a difference. Is there? Yes. Ruthlessness is about power. This is about refusing to surrender dignity to people who do not deserve deference. Cecilia thought about that while they navigated the rest of the ball. Every conversation was a test. Every smile hid calculation. But she did not disappear. She met every challenge directly. She refused to make herself smaller, and by the end of the evening, London had new gossip to whisper. The Duchess of Ravensmore was exactly as dangerous as her husband, just in different ways. 3 months into the marriage, Cecilia finally understood what Adrian had meant about Ravensmore needing a duchess who could survive storms. The house itself fought her. Servants who had spent years operating under rigid discipline struggled to adapt to someone who actually noticed them as human. Entire wings of the estate remained shuttered from decades of grief and neglect. The cliffs roared beneath every window, rain-battered stone walls. Everything about the place felt designed to break anyone soft enough to believe comfort mattered more than survival. But Cecilia refused to break. She reopened rooms that had been closed since Adrian's mother died. She brought light and warmth back into corridors that had forgotten both existed. She learned the names of every servant and started treating them like people instead of furniture. And slowly, Ravensmore started changing, not softening exactly, but becoming something that resembled a home instead of a fortress. Eliza noticed first. The child found Cecilia in the music room one afternoon where sunlight finally reached corners that had been dark for years. You opened my mother's room. I did, Cecilia confirmed. I hope that was acceptable. Eliza stared at the piano that had been silent since her mother's death. Uncle Adrian could not do it. Every time he tried, he would stand in the doorway and then leave again. Grief is complicated, Cecilia said carefully. Sometimes the things we love hurt too much to touch. Did you know my mother? No, but I know what it feels like to lose someone. Eliza sat down on the piano bench and ran fingers across keys without pressing them. Uncle Adrian says you lost yourself for a long time. The observation was too accurate to deflect. I did. How did you find yourself again? By finally getting angry enough to stop disappearing. Eliza looked up at her with those pale eyes that were learning to trust slowly. Can I play? Please. The child pressed a key and sound filled the room for the first time in 8 years. It was hesitant and unpracticed, but it was something. And Cecilia stood there watching this broken child begin healing and understood that Ravensmore was not just Adrian's house. It was hers now, too, with all the storms and grief and damaged people that came with it. The question was whether she was strong enough to help rebuild something that had been crumbling for generations, or whether she would just become another ghost haunting corridors that had already swallowed too many broken souls. That night, Adrian found her standing on the cliffs where wind screamed and ocean crashed far below. It was dangerous to stand this close to the edge, but Cecilia could not bring herself to step back into safety. He stood beside her without speaking. Finally, Cecilia found her voice. I am not certain I am strong enough for this. For what? For being the person Ravensmore needs. For standing beside you. For helping Eliza heal. For surviving London's cruelty. For all of it. Adrian was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke very quietly. When I chose you at that ball, I was not choosing someone who already knew how to survive storms. I was choosing someone who had been surviving them quietly for 28 years without anyone noticing. You are stronger than you believe, Cecilia. You simply learned to mistake endurance for weakness. What if I am just good at pretending? Then we are well matched, Adrian replied. Because I spent 15 years pretending control was the same as strength. We can learn the difference together. They stood on those violent cliffs while darkness gathered, and Cecilia made one final choice that felt like throwing herself off the edge into the ocean far below. She reached for Adrian's hand. He took it. And for the first time since the wedding, Cecilia allowed herself to believe that maybe she had not made a catastrophic mistake. Maybe she had just finally chosen herself. Even if that choice came wrapped in danger and difficulty, and a man who would never be easy to love, but might eventually be worth the cost. The wind screamed, the ocean roared, and the Duchess of Ravensmore stood on the edge of everything she had ever feared and refused to run. This time when the storm came, she would face it, and if she shattered, at least she would shatter while finally being seen. The storm Cecilia had been waiting for arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in official parliamentary seals and her brother's handwriting. She was reviewing household accounts in the morning room when the messenger delivered the envelope. The weight of it felt wrong immediately. Too heavy, too formal. The kind of correspondence that changed lives before you even broke the seal. Adrian was in London meeting with political allies about railway expansion bills that would secure Ravensmore's economic influence for the next decade. He would not return until evening. Cecilia opened the letter alone. Then she read it 3 times because her brain refused to process what her eyes were seeing. Edmund had testified before a parliamentary inquiry. Against Adrian. Her brother claimed the Duke of Ravensmore had coerced him into falsifying business records. That Adrian had threatened the entire Harrow family unless Edmund provided false testimony that would damage Adrian's political rivals. That the Duke used intimidation and blackmail as standard practice. That everything Edmund had done over the past 6 months was under duress from a man who ruled through fear. It was a comprehensive betrayal built on lies that contained just enough truth to be believable. Adrian had purchased Edmund's forged debt. Adrian had forced accountability. Adrian had made enemies through ruthless political maneuvering. Take those facts, twist them slightly, add Edmund's testimony, and suddenly the Duke of Ravensmore looked like exactly the kind of corrupt aristocrat Parliament loved to destroy. Cecilia sat in that morning room holding evidence of her family's final betrayal and felt something inside her chest go very cold and very quiet. This was not Edmund acting alone. Her brother was too weak and too stupid to orchestrate something this sophisticated. Someone else was behind this. Someone who understood how to weaponize family connection against Adrian. Someone who knew that attacking the Duke directly would fail, but attacking him through his wife's family might succeed. And Edmund had chosen to participate. Had chosen to destroy the man who had saved him from criminal prosecution. Had chosen to betray his own sister. For what? Money, probably. Or promises of protection. Maybe just because he was too much of a coward to face real consequences, and someone offered him an easier path. The reasons did not matter. The damage was already spreading. Cecilia stood up slowly and walked to the window overlooking the cliffs. The ocean was violent today. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Everything looked like a warning she had failed to notice until too late. She thought about the past 6 months. About choosing Adrian when walking away would have been safer. About standing beside him through scandal and political attacks. about finally becoming visible after 28 years of disappearing. And she realized her family had just turned all of that into a weapon aimed directly at the man she had married. Because this was not really about Adrian. This was about punishing Cecilia for choosing herself. Her mother had tried to use the marriage to avoid consequences. Cecilia had refused. Edmund had been forced into accountability. The Harrow family had lost their convenient solution to every crisis. And now they were making sure Cecilia paid for that betrayal. The truly vicious part was the timing. Adrian's railway bill was coming to a vote within the month. If Edmund's testimony gained traction, it would destroy Adrian's political credibility at exactly the moment he needed maximum influence. The bill would fail. Ravensmore would lose millions in projected revenue, and Adrian's enemies would have proof that the ruthless Duke could be damaged through conventional political attack. It was brilliantly cruel, and Cecilia's family had participated willingly. She was still standing at the window when Adrian returned that evening. He came into the morning room looking exhausted from a day of parliamentary maneuvering and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" Cecilia handed him the letter without speaking. She watched him read it, watched his expression transform from tired to controlled fury, watched him process the betrayal with that terrifying analytical precision that made him so dangerous. When he finished reading, he set the letter down very carefully. "This is Edmund's testimony." "Yes." "He is claiming I coerced him into fraud and false testimony." "Yes." And this testimony was delivered to a parliamentary inquiry investigating corruption in aristocratic business practices. Cecilia felt something cracking inside her chest. "Yes." Adrian walked to the window and stood beside her, looking out at the gathering storm. His voice when he spoke was very quiet and very controlled. "This will destroy my railway bill. It will damage Ravensmore's political influence. It will give my enemies exactly the leverage they need to undermine everything I have built over the past 15 years. I know. And your family participated willingly." "Yes." The silence that followed felt like drowning. Cecilia wanted to apologize, wanted to beg forgiveness for bringing this disaster into Adrian's life, wanted to offer to leave so he could distance himself from the damage before it became irreparable. But she had learned enough about the Duke of Ravensmore over the past 6 months to know he would view any of those responses as weakness. So instead she said the only thing that mattered. "What do you need me to do?" Adrian turned to look at her. His pale eyes were absolutely calm, but she could see the fury burning underneath. "You understand what this means. It means my family has declared war on you using me as the weapon." "Yes." "It means Edmund is willing to commit perjury to save himself from consequences." "Yes." "It means someone orchestrated this specifically to damage you at your most vulnerable moment." Adrian's expression shifted slightly. "You are thinking strategically." "I am furious," Cecilia corrected. "But fury without strategy is just noise." He almost smiled. "Who taught you that?" "You did." They stood together at the window while darkness gathered outside, and Cecilia felt the full weight of what was coming. This would not be like the Ashford affair, where Adrian could simply outmaneuver a single enemy. This was coordinated attack using parliamentary procedure and family betrayal as combined weapons. And it was designed specifically to force Adrian into an impossible choice. If he defended himself publicly, he would have to destroy the Harrow family completely. Criminal prosecution for perjury, public humiliation, financial ruin. It would prove every rumor about him being ruthless and vindictive. If he did nothing, the testimony would stand unchallenged. His enemies would have exactly the ammunition they needed. The railway bill would fail. Ravensmore's influence would diminish. Either way, he lost something. The only question was what he valued more, his political power or his wife's remaining connection to her family. Cecilia took a breath that felt like broken glass. "You need to destroy them." Adrian went very still. "What?" "Edmund committed perjury. My mother almost certainly encouraged it. Whoever orchestrated this used my family's weakness as a weapon against you. You need to prosecute them fully and publicly. You need to make them an example. And you," Adrian said quietly, "what happens to you when I destroy your family?" "I survive," Cecilia replied. "The same way I always have, by disappearing." "No, by finally cutting myself free from people who have used me as a shield against consequences my entire life." Adrian turned to face her fully. "You are telling me to destroy your brother. I am telling you to prioritize Ravensmore over my feelings about family loyalty that has never actually existed. And if I refuse, then you are letting sentiment override strategy, Cecilia said flatly. And that makes you exactly the kind of weak man your father was. The words were cruel, and she knew it. But Adrian needed to hear them from her because if he hesitated now out of some misguided attempt to protect her feelings, the damage would be catastrophic and permanent. His expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. You would stand beside me while I prosecute your own brother for perjury. Yes. Why? Because Edmund made his choice, Cecilia replied. And I made mine 6 months ago when I chose you over them. I'm not going to betray that choice now because my family decided to weaponize our connection. Adrian stared at her like he was seeing someone entirely new. You are not the woman I met at that ball. No, Cecilia agreed. I am the woman you chose to become when you refused to let me stay invisible. The silence stretched between them. Then Adrian crossed the space separating them and kissed her with an intensity that felt like claiming and fury and something deeper that neither of them had named yet. When he pulled back, his eyes were still cold, but there was something almost awed underneath. I am going to destroy them, he said quietly. Your brother, your mother, whoever orchestrated this. I am going to dismantle their lives with the same precision they tried to use against Ravensmore, and it will be vicious and public and permanent. Good. You will lose your family. I lost my family 28 years ago when they decided I was only valuable as a tool to manage their disasters. This just makes it official. Adrian touched her face with surprising gentleness. You are the most terrifying woman I have ever met. I learned from the most terrifying man in England. They stood together in that darkening room and Cecilia understood she had just crossed another line she could never uncross. She had chosen Adrian over blood, had chosen Ravensmore over family, had chosen to become exactly the kind of ruthless duchess London already feared, and she felt no guilt, just cold, satisfied certainty that she was finally done sacrificing herself for people who had never valued that sacrifice. But the storm was just beginning. The parliamentary inquiry happened 3 days later, and it was designed to be Adrian's public execution. The chamber was packed with every enemy he had made over 15 years of ruthless political maneuvering. They sat in judgment like vultures waiting for carrion. Edmund testified first, looking pale and nervous but committed to the lies someone had paid him to tell. He claimed Adrian had threatened to expose the Harrow family's debts unless Edmund provided false testimony against Lord Waverley, one of Adrian's primary political opponents. He claimed the Duke kept detailed files on every aristocrat's financial vulnerabilities. He claimed Ravensmore operated as a criminal enterprise disguised as a dukedom. It was comprehensive character assassination delivered by her own brother. Cecilia sat in the gallery watching Edmund perform betrayal with the wooden competence of a bad actor, reading lines someone else had written. She felt nothing, no pain, no grief, just cold, analytical observation. Adrian sat below looking like carved ice while Edmund destroyed his reputation one lie at a time. He did not flinch, did not object. Just let the testimony pour out like poison. When Edmund finished the inquiry, Chairman asked if the Duke of Ravensmore wished to respond. Adrian stood, and Cecilia finally understood why people truly feared him. He did not rage, did not defend, did not deny. He simply began speaking with the calm precision of a surgeon performing an autopsy on a corpse that was still breathing. Mr. Harrow has testified that I coerced him into providing false testimony. Let me address that claim with documentation. He produced the original forged promissory note, the purchase receipt showing he paid Caldwell £12,000 to prevent Edmund's criminal prosecution, the employment contract detailing Edmund's terms of service at Ravensmore. Every piece of evidence was dated, witnessed, and indisputable. Then he produced something Cecilia had not expected. Letters, dozens of them, correspondence between Edmund and someone named Victoria Ashford, Lord Ashford's sister, the woman who had tried to gain custody of Eliza months ago. Adrian read selections aloud with devastating calm. Victoria promising Edmund £50,000 if he testified against the Duke. Edmund agreeing eagerly. Victoria providing specific lies to tell. Edmund practicing his testimony like a script. The entire conspiracy laid bare in their own handwriting. When Adrian finished reading, the chamber had gone absolutely silent. He set the letters down carefully and looked directly at Edmund, who had gone the color of old snow. Mr. Harrow was not coerced into testimony. He was purchased. by individuals who understood that attacking me directly would fail, but attacking me through family connection might succeed. The question before this inquiry is not whether I am corrupt. The question is whether you will allow yourselves to be manipulated by people who weaponize perjury for political gain. Then he sat down, and the inquiry chairman looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Because Adrian had not just defended himself, he had exposed the entire conspiracy, had turned Edmund's testimony into proof of orchestrated attack, had made everyone in that chamber complicit if they chose to believe obvious lies over documented evidence. It was brutal. It was brilliant. It was exactly what Cecilia had known he would do if given the chance. The inquiry dissolved into chaos. Edmund tried to run and was detained for perjury. Lord Ashford's sister was summoned for questioning. The chairman announced a full investigation into who had orchestrated the false testimony. And Adrian walked out of that chamber like a man who had just won a war. Cecilia met him in the corridor outside. She did not ask if he was all right, did not offer comfort, just stood beside him while the political vultures scattered. "That was devastating," she said quietly. "That was necessary. My brother will go to prison. Yes, my mother will be implicated. Probably." Cecilia took a breath that hurt. "Good." Adrian looked at her with those pale eyes that saw everything. "You mean that?" "I mean it. They chose this. They weaponized me against you. They deserve whatever consequences you deliver, even if those consequences destroy them completely." Especially then. Something shifted in Adrian's expression. "You have become exactly what Ravensmore needed." "What is that?" "Someone ruthless enough to survive storms without breaking." They walked out of Parliament together while London whispered, and Cecilia understood she had just watched her family burn to ash. Edmund would face prosecution. Her mother would be publicly humiliated. The Harrow name would become synonymous with betrayal and perjury. And Cecilia felt nothing except grim satisfaction. She was done protecting people who had never protected her. But the victory was incomplete, because Victoria Ashford disappeared before she could be questioned. And 3 days later, another letter arrived at Ravensmore. This one was addressed to Cecilia. She opened it alone in the library where so many crucial moments had happened. The handwriting was elegant and feminine. The message was poison wrapped in politeness. Victoria Ashford had written to explain exactly why she had orchestrated Edmund's testimony. It was not about the railway bill. It was not about political power. It was not even about destroying Adrian. It was about Eliza. Victoria claimed the child was not Adrian's niece, but his illegitimate daughter, that Adrian's sister had never been married, that the entire story about a dead mother and orphaned ward was fabrication designed to hide the Duke's moral corruption. And Victoria had proof, a birth certificate listing Adrian Blackwell as the father, testimony from a midwife who had delivered the child, letters allegedly written by Adrian's sister confessing the truth. It was all lies. Cecilia knew it was lies because she had spent months watching Adrian with Eliza. The way he protected her was not fatherly guilt. It was chosen devotion. The child was his niece. The story was true. But Victoria's evidence was sophisticated enough to create doubt. And doubt was all she needed. The letter concluded with a threat wrapped in diplomatic language. Victoria would keep the evidence private if Adrian withdrew his prosecution of Edmund and publicly apologized for the damage done to the Ashford family's reputation. If he refused, she would release everything to the press. The scandal would destroy Eliza's reputation permanently. The child would become a symbol of aristocratic corruption. She would never escape the gossip, never have a normal life, never be seen as anything except the Duke's shameful secret, and Adrian would have to choose between justice and the one person he loved more than power. Cecilia read the letter 4 times. Then she stood up and walked to the window overlooking the cliffs where the ocean crashed with mindless violence against ancient stone. She thought about Eliza playing piano in the music room, about the child finally learning to trust, about 8 years old being too young to survive the kind of scandal Victoria was threatening to create. And she understood exactly what Victoria was counting on. Adrian would surrender to protect Eliza. He would withdraw this prosecution, would apologize publicly, would let Edmund walk free and Victoria escape consequences. Because the alternative was destroying a child who had already survived too much damage. It was the perfect trap. Because Adrian's greatest strength was his absolute refusal to sacrifice the people he protected. And Victoria had found the one person whose vulnerability would override his ruthlessness. Cecilia stood at that window for a long time. Then she made a choice that would define everything that came after. She burned the letter, and she told Adrian nothing. Heat. The decision felt like swallowing broken glass. Cecilia spent the next 3 days moving through Ravensmore like a ghost while Adrian prepared for Edmund's criminal trial. He was meticulous in his planning, every piece of evidence documented, every witness prepared. He was going to destroy her brother with legal precision, and Cecilia said nothing about Victoria's threat, because telling Adrian meant forcing him to choose between justice and protecting Eliza. And that choice would destroy something fundamental in him. He would choose Eliza, would surrender, would let the conspiracy escape consequences. And then he would spend the rest of his life knowing he had been manipulated through the one vulnerability he could not defend. It would break him. Not obviously, not dramatically, but slowly and completely until the ruthless Duke of Ravensmore became just another weak man ruled by fear instead of principle. Cecilia could not let that happen, so she made the choice for him. She contacted Victoria Ashford directly. They met in a public garden where afternoon sunlight made everything look deceptively peaceful. Victoria was beautiful in that calculated way that took hours of effort to appear effortless. She smiled when Cecilia approached like they were friends meeting for tea instead of enemies negotiating terms of war. Lady Cecilia, how unexpected. You sent me a letter, Cecilia said flatly. I am responding. Victoria's smile went sharp. I sent that letter to give you options. You could convince your husband to be reasonable, or you could watch a child's life be destroyed for the sake of his pride. That child is innocent. That child is leverage, Victoria corrected. And your husband understands leverage better than anyone. He will make the rational choice. Cecilia sat down on the bench across from Victoria and forced herself to breathe slowly. What do you actually want? I want Adrian Blackwell to understand he is not untouchable, Victoria said. I want him to know that his enemies can hurt him through the people he protects. I want him humiliated and diminished and forced to bow. And my brother, Edmund, goes free. The perjury charges disappear. Your family avoids prosecution, in exchange for Adrian's public surrender, in exchange for teaching the ruthless Duke that even he has limits. Cecilia studied the woman across from her and recognized something she had seen in her own mirror for 28 years. Victoria Ashford was invisible, beautiful but unmarried, wealthy but powerless. The spare sister used for political maneuvering but never valued for herself, and she had chosen to burn the world rather than accept that invisibility. Cecilia understood that impulse, but she had learned a different lesson. Power acquired through destroying others was just violence wearing expensive clothes, and violence always consumed the people who wielded it. I have a counteroffer, Cecilia said quietly. Victoria laughed. You're in no position to negotiate. You have fabricated evidence about a child. You have orchestrated perjury. You have admitted to blackmail in the letter you sent me. That letter is currently in the hands of Adrian's solicitor, with instructions to deliver it to authorities if anything happens to me or anyone in my family. The lie came out smooth as silk. Victoria's smile disappeared. You are bluffing. Test me. They stared at each other across 3 feet of garden bench, while the world continued being deceptively peaceful around them. What is your counteroffer? Victoria said finally. You destroy your fabricated evidence. You withdraw permanently from London. You never contact my family or anyone connected to Ravensmore again. And in exchange, I will convince Adrian to drop the criminal prosecution of Edmund. Why would you protect your brother after he betrayed you? I am not protecting Edmund, Cecilia corrected. I am protecting Eliza. There is a difference. And if I refuse, then I release your confession letter and watch you face prosecution for conspiracy and blackmail. Your brother already lost his political career. You will lose your freedom. Victoria's face had gone pale. Adrian would never agree to drop the prosecution. Adrian will agree to whatever I ask, Cecilia said, because he trusts me. The words were true, and they were also the most dangerous gamble she had ever taken. Because if Adrian discovered she had negotiated behind his back, had made deals without his knowledge, had prioritized protecting him over trusting him with choices, it would shatter something fundamental between them. But Cecilia had learned that sometimes love meant making impossible choices so the people you cared about did not have to break themselves. Victoria stared at her for a long moment. Then she stood up slowly. You are more ruthless than your husband. No, Cecilia replied. I am just more willing to sacrifice myself than sacrifice a child. Victoria walked away without another word, and Cecilia sat alone in that garden, understanding she had just committed herself to a course of action that could destroy her marriage before it ever really began. Because now she had to convince Adrian to drop the prosecution without telling him why, had to make him surrender justice without explaining about Victoria's threat, had to lie to the one person who had built their entire relationship on ruthless honesty. And if he ever discovered the truth, he would never forgive her. She found Adrian in his study that evening, reviewing trial preparations. He looked up when she entered, and she saw the exhaustion underneath his controlled expression. This prosecution was costing him more than he would admit, not because he cared about destroying Edmund, but because forcing Cecilia to watch her family burn was damaging something between them he did not know how to protect. "I need to ask you something," Cecilia said quietly. Adrian set down the papers he had been reading. "What?" "I need you to drop the prosecution against Edmund." The silence that followed was absolute. Adrian stood very slowly. "You want me to let your brother escape consequences for perjury?" "Yes." "Why?" Cecilia had prepared for this, had spent 3 days constructing an argument that would sound reasonable without revealing Victoria's threat. "Because this prosecution is destroying you. I am fine." "You're not fine," Cecilia said. "You are forcing yourself to dismantle my family while watching me pretend I do not care. You are choosing justice over protecting my feelings. You are trying to be ruthless when everything about this situation requires something gentler. There is nothing gentle about perjury. I know. But there is something human about mercy." Adrian walked around the desk until he stood close enough that she could see the fury building behind his controlled expression. "Your brother tried to destroy me using parliamentary procedure. He testified falsely. He participated in conspiracy. He weaponized your connection to me. And you want me to forgive that. I want you to let it go." "Why?" "Because holding on to it is turning you into exactly the kind of man your enemies claim you are." The words hit harder than she intended. Adrian's expression went very cold. "You think I am becoming a monster. I think you are becoming consumed by the need for justice, instead of remembering why that justice matters." "And why does it matter?" "Because the people you protect are more important than the people you punish." Adrian stared at her. "This is about Eliza." "Everything is about Eliza," Cecilia replied. "You built Ravensmore to protect her. You married me because you needed someone who would not hurt her. You destroyed Ashford because he tried to take her away. Every ruthless thing you do is ultimately about keeping that child safe. So you understand why I cannot let Edmund escape consequences." "I understand why you think you cannot," Cecilia corrected. "But Edmund is already destroyed. His reputation is ruined. His testimony exposed as lies. Prosecuting him criminally will not change anything except making you look vindictive. I do not care how I look." "You should, because Eliza watches everything you do. And if she sees you choose vengeance over mercy, she will learn that love looks like punishment." It was a low blow, and Cecilia knew it. But she was running out of arguments that did not involve confessing about Victoria's blackmail. Adrian turned away from her and walked to the window. His voice when he spoke was very quiet. "You are asking me to surrender. I am asking you to choose what matters most. And if I refuse, then you prosecute Edmund and we survive it. But something between us changes permanently." Adrian looked back at her. "Are you threatening me?" "I am telling you the truth," Cecilia replied. "I cannot stand beside you through a trial that destroys my brother without it damaging something fundamental about who we are to each other. I am not strong enough for that." The admission felt like confession, because it was true even if her reasons were lies. Adrian studied her face for a long time. Then he spoke very carefully. "If I drop this prosecution, I am sending a message that attacking me through family connection works. Every enemy I have will know they can damage me by manipulating the people I care about. Only if you let it look like surrender," Cecilia said. "Frame it as mercy, as choosing the high ground, as refusing to waste energy on a broken man who already lost everything that mattered. That is spin. That is strategy." They stared at each other across the study, and Cecilia felt the full weight of what she was asking. Adrian had spent 15 years building a reputation that made enemies afraid to attack him. And she was asking him to soften that reputation for reasons he could not understand, because she refused to tell him the truth. If he agreed, he was trusting her completely. If he refused, she would have to confess about Victoria and watch him choose between justice and protecting Eliza. Either way, something broke. The question was what they valued more: the relationship they had built on honesty or the people they were trying to protect. Adrian crossed back to her in 3 strides. His pale eyes were absolutely cold, but there was something almost desperate underneath. If I do this, you never ask me to surrender justice again. I will never ask you to surrender justice, Cecilia replied. Only vengeance. There is no difference. Yes, there is. Justice protects. Vengeance destroys. You taught me that. Adrian touched her face with surprising gentleness. You are lying to me about something. The observation hit like a blade. Cecilia forced herself to meet his eyes. Yes. What? Something I am protecting you from. I do not need protection. Everyone needs protection, Cecilia said quietly. Even ruthless dukes who think control is the same as safety. They stood very close while truth and lies twisted between them. Then Adrian made a choice that would change everything. I will drop the prosecution. I will frame it as mercy. I will let your brother escape criminal consequences. Relief flooded through her. Thank you. But you will tell me what you're hiding, Adrian continued. Eventually. When you are ready. And when you do, I will decide whether I can forgive being protected from choices that should have been mine. The words were not quite threat and not quite promise. Cecilia nodded slowly. Fair enough. Adrian kissed her then with an intensity that felt like claiming and fury and something almost broken. When he pulled back, his eyes were still cold, but there was pain underneath now. I am trusting you, he said quietly. Do not make me regret it. I will try not to. That is not a promise. No, Cecilia agreed, but it is honest. He walked out of the study to withdraw the prosecution, and Cecilia stood alone, understanding she had just saved Eliza and Adrian both. But the cost was a lie she could never take back. And when the truth eventually surfaced, it would destroy whatever remained between them. The lie lived between them for 6 weeks, like a third presence in every room. Cecilia watched Adrian navigate Parliament with renewed political strength after the prosecution withdrawal was framed as strategic mercy rather than weakness. His enemies had expected vindictiveness and received calculated restraint instead. The railway bill passed with overwhelming support. Ravensmore's economic influence expanded exactly as planned. And every night Adrian came home to a wife who smiled and managed the household and stood beside him at social functions while carrying a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. Victoria Ashford had disappeared from London as promised. Edmund lived in exile somewhere in Scotland, avoiding prosecution and social ruin. The conspiracy had collapsed. The threats had ended. But the cost was a foundation built on deception. Cecilia told herself it was worth it. Eliza was safe. Adrian's reputation remained intact. The choice had been necessary. Sometimes love required protecting people from impossible decisions. She told herself this every morning. She believed it less each time. Because Adrian was not stupid. He knew she had lied about something. Knew she was protecting him from information he deserved to have. And every day that knowledge lived in his eyes, watching her with the patient inevitability of a man waiting for truth to surface. It created a distance between them that felt like standing on opposite sides of a widening chasm. They still functioned as Duke and Duchess, still managed Ravensmore together, still presented unified authority to London society. But the intimacy that had been building between them since the wedding had frozen into something careful and guarded. Cecilia felt herself disappearing again. Not obviously, not dramatically, just slowly making herself smaller to avoid the confrontation she knew was coming. Then Victoria Ashford's body was found in the Thames. In quotes. The news reached Ravensmore through official channels 3 days after a fisherman discovered her corpse tangled in dock pilings. Drowning was the initial conclusion, possible suicide. The woman had been despondent over her brother's political collapse and social exile. London whispered appropriate sympathies while secretly relieved that another scandal had resolved itself conveniently. Adrian received the report in his study. Cecilia was reviewing household accounts when he found her in the morning room. His expression was absolutely controlled, but she had learned to read the tension underneath. Victoria Ashford is dead, he said without preamble. Cecilia felt ice sliding down her spine. How? Drowning. Authorities believe suicide. Do you believe that? No. The word hung between them like an accusation. Cecilia set down her pen very carefully. Why not? Because Victoria Ashford spent months orchestrating conspiracy against me. She manipulated your brother into perjury. She disappeared from London exactly when my prosecution was withdrawn, and now she is conveniently dead before she could ever testify about who else was involved. You think someone killed her? I think someone ensured she would never become a liability, Adrian replied. The question is who benefited most from her silence. He was watching her with those pale eyes that saw everything, and Cecilia realized with horrifying clarity that Adrian suspected her, not of murder, but of knowing more about Victoria's disappearance than she had admitted, of being connected somehow to the conspiracy's convenient resolution. I did not kill her, Cecilia said quietly. I never suggested you did. But you think I know something about it. Adrian crossed the room until he stood close enough that she could see the fury and confusion warring behind his controlled expression. I think you have been lying to me for 6 weeks. I think you negotiated something with Victoria that you refused to tell me about. I think that negotiation is connected to why you asked me to drop Edmund's prosecution. And now Victoria is dead, and I am trying to determine whether my wife is involved in conspiracy or just protecting me from truth I deserve to know. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Cecilia stood up slowly. You think I am capable of orchestrating murder. I think you are capable of doing terrible things to protect people you care about, Adrian corrected. I'd have watched you transform from invisible wallflower into someone ruthless enough to stand beside me through political warfare. The question is how far that ruthlessness extends. She wanted to confess everything. Wanted to tell him about Victoria's blackmail and the fabricated evidence and the choice she had made to protect Eliza without forcing him to surrender. Wanted to explain that every lie had been motivated by love, even if the method was wrong. But the words stuck in her throat because telling him now meant admitting she had manipulated him for weeks, had made decisions that should have been his, had treated him like someone who needed protection instead of partnership. And that betrayal might be worse than the original lie. I did not kill Victoria Ashford, Cecilia said again, and I do not know who did, but you do know something. Yes, tell me. The command was delivered quietly, but with absolute authority. Cecilia met his eyes and saw the exact moment this became a test. If she confessed now, they might survive it. If she continued lying, the distance between them would become permanent. She took a breath that hurt. Victoria sent me a letter 6 weeks ago. She threatened to release fabricated evidence claiming Eliza was your illegitimate daughter. She said she would destroy the child's reputation unless you withdrew Edmund's prosecution and publicly apologized to the Ashford family. Adrian went very still. What? She had birth certificates, testimony from a midwife, letters allegedly from your sister. All lies but sophisticated enough to create scandal. And you said nothing. I contacted Victoria directly. I negotiated her permanent withdrawal from London in exchange for convincing you to drop the prosecution. I protected you from having to choose between justice and protecting Eliza. By lying to me. By making an impossible choice so you did not have to break yourself. The silence that followed felt like the end of something. Adrian turned away from her and walked to the window. His voice when he spoke was very quiet and very controlled. You manipulated me. I protected you. You made decisions that were mine to make, Adrian corrected. You treated me like someone too weak to handle difficult choices. You lied to me for 6 weeks while I trusted you completely. Because telling you meant forcing you to surrender, Cecilia said. And I could not watch you become the kind of man who lets children suffer to maintain his pride. So instead you became the kind of woman who lies to her husband and calls it love. The words hit like a blade. Cecilia felt tears burning behind her eyes and refused to let them fall. I made the best choice I could with impossible options. No, Adrian said flatly. You made the choice that let you control the outcome. You decided I was not capable of handling Victoria's threat myself. You decided my judgment could not be trusted. You decided to manage me like I was another crisis instead of your partner. That is not what happened. That is exactly what happened. Adrian turned back to face her, and his expression was absolutely cold. You spent 28 years being managed by your family, being treated like a tool to solve other people's problems. And the moment you had power, you did the same thing to me. The accusation was so accurate it stole her breath. Because he was right. Cecilia had spent her entire life being invisible and controlled and used, and the first time she had real power, she had wielded it exactly the way her family had wielded theirs, by making decisions for someone else without their knowledge or consent. She had become what she hated. I am sorry, she whispered. Sorry is not enough, Adrian replied. You fundamentally do not trust me. And without trust, we have nothing except a political alliance that happens to include a marriage certificate. That is not true. Prove it. Cecilia stared at him. How? Tell me everything, Adrian said. Every conversation with Victoria, every negotiation, every choice you made without consulting me. Everything you have been hiding for 6 weeks. And if I do, then we decide whether this marriage can survive your lies or whether we are better off maintaining appearances while living separate lives. The ultimatum was delivered without emotion, but it landed like a death sentence. Cecilia understood what he was offering: confession and possible forgiveness, or continued deception and permanent distance. She had spent 6 weeks protecting him from truth. Now he was demanding she trust him with it. So she told him everything. Mott. The confession took 2 hours. Cecilia laid out every detail: Victoria's letter, the threat against Eliza, the fabricated evidence, her decision to negotiate without telling him, the lie about needing mercy, the calculated manipulation. Adrian listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence felt like drowning. Then Adrian spoke very quietly. Victoria had documentation claiming Eliza was my illegitimate daughter. Yes. And you believed that documentation would destroy her. Yes. So you protected me from having to choose between the child I love and the justice I demanded. Cecilia nodded. Adrian walked to his desk and pulled out a folder she had never seen before. He set it down between them. Open it. She did. Inside were documents identical to the ones Victoria had threatened to release. Birth certificates listing Adrian as father, midwife testimony, letters from his sister, and notarized certifications proving every single document was fabricated. Cecilia felt the world tilt. You knew. I have known about Victoria's forgeries for 8 months, Adrian said, since before I ever approached you at that ball. She attempted this same blackmail scheme against me a year ago. I had investigators trace every document back to the forger she hired. I have been waiting for her to try again so I could prosecute her for fraud and extortion. But she disappeared because you negotiated her withdrawal before I could spring the trap I had spent a year constructing. Cecilia stared at the evidence in front of her. You were never vulnerable to her threats. No, Adrian agreed. But you assumed I was. You assumed I had not already prepared for exactly this kind of attack. You assumed I needed protection instead of trusting that I had handled it myself. The realization hit like a physical blow. Everything Cecilia had done to protect Adrian had been unnecessary. The lies, the manipulation, the 6 weeks of deception, all of it based on the assumption that he could not defend himself. She had treated him exactly the way her family had treated her, like someone who needed managing instead of partnership. I did not know, she whispered. No, Adrian said. Because you did not ask. You made assumptions and acted on them without consultation. You decided I was too emotionally compromised to handle threats against Eliza. You treated me like I was weak. I thought I was protecting you. You were controlling me, Adrian corrected. And control disguised as protection is just another form of manipulation. Cecilia felt something cracking inside her chest. What do you want me to say? I want you to understand why this is unforgivable. Adrian's voice was still quiet, but there was something broken underneath now. I spent 15 years rebuilding Ravensmore from ruins left by a father who believed charm could substitute for character. I watched my mother fade because she married a man who made decisions for her instead of with her. I swore I would never become that kind of man. And I chose you because you seemed strong enough to stand beside me as an equal. I am strong enough. No, Adrian said. You are strong enough to survive, but you are not strong enough to trust. And without trust, we are just two people performing a marriage instead of living one. The words felt like a door closing. Cecilia wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself, wanted to explain that everything she had done came from love, even if the execution was wrong. But Adrian was right. She had not trusted him to handle Victoria's threat, had not trusted him to make the right choice about Edmund's prosecution, had not trusted him to balance justice and protecting Eliza without breaking. She had treated him exactly the way weak people treated those they claimed to love, by making choices for them instead of with them. What happens now? She asked quietly. Now you leave, Adrian replied. Pack what you need, return to your family, or find rooms in London. I do not care. But you do not stay here while I decide whether this marriage can survive your fundamental lack of faith in me. You are throwing me out. I'm giving you time to determine whether you want a partnership or just someone to manage, Adrian corrected. When you have an answer, come back and we will discuss whether we have a future. Cecilia felt tears finally breaking through. And if I refuse to leave, then I will know you learned nothing, and we truly are finished. The ultimatum was absolute. Cecilia looked at this man she had married, this dangerous duke who had chosen her when she was invisible and trusted her with everything, and understood she had destroyed the one relationship that had ever made her feel seen. All because she could not let go of the need to control outcomes instead of trusting in partnership. She left Ravensmore that afternoon with a single trunk and a heart that felt like it had been carved from her chest. London welcomed her back like a prodigal daughter returning to captivity. Cecilia took rooms in a hotel near Mayfair and spent 3 days staring at walls while the city whispered about the Duchess of Ravensmore living separately from her husband. The gossip was vicious and gleeful. Bets resumed about how long the marriage would last. 6 months had been optimistic, apparently. She did not contact Adrian, did not beg for forgiveness, did not try to explain or justify or manipulate her way back into his life. She simply existed in the hollow space between who she had been and who she needed to become. On the 4th day, Eliza appeared at her door. The child stood in the hotel corridor looking small and fierce and absolutely furious. "You left." Cecilia felt her heart crack. "Yes. Uncle Adrian will not talk about it. He just works constantly and looks like someone carved him from ice. The servants whisper that you had a terrible fight." "We did." "About what?" "About me lying to him," Cecilia said honestly. "About me trying to protect him instead of trusting him." Eliza studied her with those pale eyes that were far too old. "Did you lie to protect me?" The question revealed everything. This 8-year-old child had lived through enough adult manipulation to recognize the pattern immediately. "Yes," Cecilia admitted, "someone threatened to hurt you. I lied to your uncle to stop it. And in doing so, I broke his trust. Was the threat real? It felt real at the time. But it was not." "No," Cecilia said quietly. "Your uncle had already handled it. I just did not know that because I assumed he needed my protection instead of asking." Eliza considered this. "So you treated him like he was stupid." "I treated him like he was vulnerable," Cecilia corrected. "There is a difference." "Not really," Eliza replied. "Adults always say they are protecting children when really they just do not trust us to handle truth." The observation was devastating in its accuracy. Cecilia had spent 6 weeks doing to Adrian exactly what every adult in Eliza's life had done to her. Making decisions based on assumed vulnerability instead of actual capacity. "I made a terrible mistake," Cecilia said. "Are you going to fix it? I do not know if I can." Eliza sat down on the chair near the door without being invited. "Uncle Adrian says mistakes only matter if you learn nothing from them. Did you learn something?" Cecilia thought about the past 4 days. About realizing that control disguised as protection was just manipulation wearing a kinder mask. About understanding that she had spent 28 years being managed by her family and then immediately replicated that dynamic the moment she had power. "I learned that loving someone means trusting them even when that trust is terrifying," she said quietly. "I learned that partnership requires faith in someone else's strength instead of assuming they need your management. I learned that I became exactly what I hated because I did not understand the difference between helping and controlling." Eliza nodded slowly. "That is a good thing to learn. It came too late." "Maybe," the child said. "Or maybe Uncle Adrian is waiting to see if you actually learned it, or just said you did." "What makes you think that?" "Because he told me you were strong enough to survive anything except your own fear of losing control. And he said the only question was whether you would choose to be strong or choose to be safe." Cecilia felt tears burning again. "When did he say that?" "Yesterday, when I asked why you left." They sat together in silence while hotel sounds filtered through walls, and Cecilia understood Adrian had given her exactly what she needed. Space to choose whether she wanted partnership or just the illusion of intimacy while maintaining control. The terrifying part was choosing partnership meant surrendering the only power she had ever known. The power to manage outcomes by controlling information. "Do you think he will forgive me?" Cecilia asked. "I think he will if you prove you understand what you did wrong," Eliza replied. "Uncle Adrian does not forgive easily, but he forgives completely when someone earns it. How do I earn it? By trusting him the way he trusted you." The answer was simple and impossible. Because trust required vulnerability, Cecilia had spent 28 years learning to avoid. But staying safe meant losing the only person who had ever made her feel alive. She looked at this 8-year-old child who had survived more damage than most adults endured in a lifetime and found wisdom in someone half her age. "Will you tell me honestly if I am making another mistake?" Cecilia asked. "Always," Eliza replied. "That is what family does." The word hit harder than anything else. Family. Not obligation, not duty, not people who used you until you broke, but chosen connection based on truth instead of convenience. Cecilia took a breath that felt like drowning. "Then I'm going back to Ravensmore. I'm going to trust your uncle with the truth about how terrified I am of losing control. I am going to stop trying to protect him and start trying to partner with him. And if he still wants me gone after that, then I will leave knowing I finally chose honesty over safety." Eliza almost smiled. "Good. The house is too quiet without you. I might make it worse when I return." "That is fine," the child said. "Quiet is worse than complicated." She left as abruptly as she had arrived, and Cecilia sat alone in that hotel room. Understanding an 8-year-old had just taught her more about love than 28 years of her family ever had. Talk. She returned to Ravensmore the next morning. The carriage ride felt like traveling toward execution instead of home. Cecilia spent the entire journey rehearsing what she would say and discarding every prepared speech as inadequate. "How did you explain that you finally understood the difference between protection and control? How did you prove you were choosing trust over safety? How did you ask forgiveness for treating someone like they needed management instead of partnership?" Ravensmore appeared on the cliffs like a fortress designed to repel weakness. Cecilia walked through those doors feeling like an invader instead of a duchess. Adrian was in his study reviewing correspondence. He looked up when she entered, and his expression gave away absolutely nothing. "You came back." "I came back," Cecilia agreed. "Not to beg, not to manipulate, just to tell you the truth. I should have told you 6 weeks ago." "Which is what?" "That I am terrified of trusting anyone because everyone I ever trusted used that trust against me. That I learned control was safer than vulnerability. That I spent 28 years managing crises for people who never valued that sacrifice. And when I finally had someone who chose me, I immediately replicated the only dynamic I knew." Adrian set down the paper slowly. "Go on. I lied to you about Victoria because I could not bear the thought of you being forced to choose between justice and protecting Eliza. But the real reason was that I could not bear giving up control of the outcome. I needed to manage the situation because managing is the only power I have ever known. And now I understand that power acquired through control is just loneliness disguised as safety," Cecilia said. "I understand that I hurt you by treating you like someone who needed protection instead of someone capable of handling difficult truth. I understand that partnership requires trusting you, even when that trust terrifies me." Adrian stood and walked around the desk. "Do you trust me now?" "No," Cecilia admitted. "Not completely, because trust is not a switch I can flip. It is something I have to learn slowly by choosing vulnerability over safety, even when every instinct tells me to control the outcome." "So what are you asking for?" "Time," Cecilia said, "and patience, and the chance to prove I can learn to trust you the way you trusted me. And if you cannot learn, then you will know I am not strong enough for this marriage, and we end it honestly instead of living a lie." The answer was the hardest thing she had ever said, because it meant surrendering the last shred of control she had been clinging to. Adrian studied her face for a long time. Then he spoke very quietly. "I'm not angry because you lied to protect Eliza. I'm angry because you assumed I could not handle the choice myself. You treated me like I was my father, weak and controlled by emotion instead of principle. I know. Do you understand why that is unforgivable?" "Yes," Cecilia said, "because you spent 15 years proving you were nothing like him, and I destroyed that proof by assuming you would collapse under pressure the same way he did." The acknowledgement seemed to satisfy something in him. Adrian crossed the space between them. His pale eyes were still cold, but there was something almost gentle underneath. "I do not need you to be fearless. I need you to be honest, even when honesty is terrifying, even when it means admitting you are scared or uncertain or making choices based on fear instead of strength. I'm scared right now. Of what? That you will never forgive me. That I destroyed something we can never rebuild. That I will spend the rest of my life being married to someone who does not trust me anymore." Adrian touched her face with surprising gentleness. "I do not forgive easily, but I forgive you." The words should have brought relief. Instead, they brought something heavier. "Why?" Cecilia whispered. "Because you came back," Adrian said. You could have stayed in London and let distance make the separation permanent. You could have tried to manipulate your way back into my life. You could have blamed me for being unreasonable. Instead, you came back and told me the truth, even knowing I might reject you anyway. That is not forgiveness. That is just acknowledging honesty. No, Adrian corrected. That is understanding you finally chose vulnerability over control. And vulnerability is the only foundation partnership can build on. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like any kiss they had shared before. Not claiming, not strategic, just honest and broken and surprisingly gentle. When he pulled back, Cecilia felt tears on her face. I do not know how to do this, she admitted. How to trust instead of control. How to choose partnership instead of management. How to be strong enough to be vulnerable. Neither do I, Adrian said. But we learn together, the same way we learn everything else, by surviving storms, by refusing to run from them. They stood together in that study, and Cecilia felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing exactly, but the beginning of it. The beginning of understanding that maybe strength was not about control. Maybe it was about choosing trust, even when trust felt like standing on a cliff edge with nothing but faith to prevent the fall. But London was not finished testing them. 2 days after Cecilia returned to Ravensmore, investigators announced Victoria Ashford's death was not suicide. It was murder. And the evidence pointed directly at someone with motive, means, and opportunity to ensure Victoria's silence permanently. Someone who benefited from her death. Someone who had negotiated with her weeks before she died. The accusations hit like an avalanche. Cecilia was summoned for questioning by authorities investigating whether the Duchess of Ravensmore had orchestrated murder to protect her husband's reputation and her family's secrets. Every conversation she had with Victoria was scrutinized. Every action dissected. Every lie she had told Adrian became evidence of someone capable of violence disguised as protection. And London watched with gleeful horror as the woman who had stood beside the ruthless Duke became the target of investigation herself. Adrian received the summons in his study. Cecilia stood across from him, feeling like she was drowning while he read the accusations with terrifying calm. When he finished, he looked up at her with those pale winter eyes. Did you kill Victoria Ashford? No. Do you know who did? No. But you negotiated with her weeks before she died. Yes. And you lied to me about those negotiations. Yes. Adrian set the summons down very carefully. Then we have a problem. What problem? Every lie you told me to protect our family now looks like consciousness of guilt. Every secret you kept makes you appear capable of murder. Every choice you made without consulting me becomes evidence that you are willing to do terrible things to control outcomes. Cecilia felt ice sliding through her veins. You think I'm guilty? I think you look guilty, Adrian corrected. An appearance is all that matters when the authorities want someone to prosecute. So what do? We tell the truth, Adrian said. All of it. Every conversation with Victoria, every negotiation, every lie you told me and why. We lay everything bare and trust that honesty is stronger than circumstantial evidence. And if honesty is not enough, then you face prosecution for a murder you did not commit while I watched the woman I love be destroyed by consequences of choices made to protect me. The words hit like a blade. Because this was the cost of her lies finally coming due. Not just damaged trust between them, but potential destruction of everything they had built. Cecilia looked at Adrian and saw something she had never seen before in those cold, controlled eyes. Fear. Not for himself. For her. I am sorry, she whispered. Sorry will not save you, Adrian replied. Only truth will. And even truth might not be enough. Then we fight. Yes, he agreed. We fight. Together. The way we should have done from the beginning. They stood together in that study while storm clouds gathered outside, and Cecilia understood that choosing vulnerability had not made things easier. It had just made them honest. And honesty was about to be tested by fire. The summons demanded her appearance before investigators the next morning. 12 hours to prepare a defense against murder accusations built on her own lies, and London's eagerness to watch the Duchess of Ravensmore burn. Adrian spent those 12 hours building a case that would either save her or prove inadequate against the weight of circumstantial evidence and social appetite for scandal. And Cecilia spent them understanding that sometimes choosing trust meant accepting you could not control whether that trust was enough. Dawn arrived with rain and summons. Cecilia dressed in somber colors appropriate for someone facing murder investigation. Adrian stood beside her looking like controlled violence barely contained by expensive tailoring. Together they walked into the authorities' offices to face accusations that would either clear her name or destroy everything they had fought to build. The interrogation room was small and cold and designed to make guilty people confess. Cecilia sat across from investigators who looked at her like she was already convicted, and she began telling the truth. All of it, without protection, without control, without any certainty that honesty would be enough to save her from consequences of lies told in love's name. Adrian sat beside her, silent, watching, waiting to see whether the woman he had chosen was strong enough to survive truth, or whether they would both drown in the wreckage of deceptions finally brought to light. The lead investigator leaned forward with a smile that promised nothing good. Let us begin with the first time you contacted Victoria Ashford, Duchess, and please do not leave out any details. We will know if you are lying. The interrogation lasted 7 hours. Cecilia told them everything without hesitation or embellishment. She described Victoria's blackmail letter in precise detail. She explained the fabricated evidence threatening Eliza. She admitted to meeting Victoria in the garden and negotiating her withdrawal from London. She confessed to lying to Adrian about why she wanted Edmund's prosecution dropped. Every word was truth stripped of protection. The lead investigator was a man named Thornton, who had built a career prosecuting aristocrats stupid enough to believe their titles exempted them from consequences. He listened to Cecilia's confession with the patient attention of someone waiting for contradictions to emerge. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied her face. That is a remarkable story, Duchess. You expect us to believe you negotiated with a woman threatening your family, and then she conveniently died before anyone could verify these claims. I do not expect you to believe anything, Cecilia replied. I am telling you what happened. Whether you believe it is your decision. How convenient that the only witness to your negotiation is dead. Very inconvenient, actually, Cecilia corrected. If Victoria were alive, she could confirm everything I just told you. Her death makes me look guilty of something I did not do. Thornton pulled out a folder and opened it slowly. We have testimony from hotel staff that you met with Victoria Ashford on 3 separate occasions. You claimed only one meeting. Cecilia felt ice sliding down her spine. I met with her once in the garden. I have no knowledge of other meetings. Hotel staff identified you entering Miss Ashford's rooms twice in the week before her death. That is impossible. I was never in her rooms. Thornton slid photographs across the table. Images of a woman entering Victoria's hotel. The figure was obscured by shadows and distance, but wore clothing similar to what Cecilia owned. This was a trap. Someone had impersonated her, had created evidence placing her at Victoria's residence multiple times, had built a case that looked damning enough to survive initial scrutiny, and Cecilia had no way to prove it was fabrication without sounding exactly like every guilty aristocrat who claimed innocence while evidence proved otherwise. Adrian spoke for the first time since the interrogation began. Those photographs are not conclusive. The woman's face is not visible. The clothing matches items owned by the Duchess, Thornton replied. The timing corresponds with when Miss Ashford was alive. And the Duchess has already admitted to negotiating with the victim. Negotiating is not murder, Adrian said coldly. No, Thornton agreed. But it establishes motive, means, and opportunity. Your wife had reason to want Miss Ashford silenced. She had access to her, and she has already demonstrated willingness to lie to protect family interests. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Cecilia understood exactly what was happening. Someone had orchestrated Victoria's murder and framed her for it. Someone who understood that her lies to Adrian would make her look guilty. Someone who knew the photographs would be circumstantial but damning enough to create reasonable suspicion. This was not random violence. This was calculated destruction aimed at removing both Victoria and Cecilia simultaneously. Who benefits from both of us being gone? Cecilia asked quietly. Thornton raised an eyebrow. Excuse me, Victoria Ashford tried to blackmail my husband and failed. I negotiated her withdrawal from London. Now she is dead, and I am being investigated for her murder. Who benefits from both of us being removed from the equation? That is not my concern, Thornton replied. My concern is determining whether you killed Miss Ashford. Then you are asking the wrong questions, Cecilia said, because whoever killed Victoria also framed me for it. Which means you are looking for someone sophisticated enough to orchestrate murder, create false evidence, and manipulate an investigation. or I'm looking at a duchess desperate enough to commit murder and arrogant enough to think her title will protect her from consequences. Adrian stood abruptly. This interrogation is over. My wife has answered your questions honestly. If you have evidence sufficient to charge her, then do so. Otherwise, we are leaving. Thornton smiled. You're welcome to leave, Your Grace, but the Duchess remains until we have completed our investigation. Under what authority? Under the authority of a preliminary finding of probable cause for murder. The words landed like a death sentence. Cecilia felt the room tilt because she understood what Thornton was saying. They were detaining her, not arresting yet, but holding her while they gathered additional evidence or waited for her to confess under pressure. And Adrian could do nothing to stop it without looking like he was obstructing justice. She met his eyes across that cold interrogation room and saw fury and fear and something that looked almost like helplessness. The ruthless Duke of Ravensmore, who controlled everything through sheer force of will, was powerless to protect his wife from consequences of lies she had told to protect him. It was the cruelest symmetry imaginable. I will handle this, Adrian said quietly. No, Cecilia replied. You will let the investigation proceed. You will not obstruct justice. You will not use your influence to manipulate the outcome. You are telling me to let you face this alone. I am telling you to trust the truth the same way you asked me to trust you. The words were deliberate echo of their conversation days earlier. Adrian stared at her and she saw the exact moment he understood what she was doing. She was choosing vulnerability over control, was trusting that honesty would be enough even when evidence looked damning, was refusing to let him sacrifice his principles to save her. It was the first time she had truly trusted him. And it was happening while she was being detained for murder she did not commit. Find who killed Victoria, Cecilia said. Find who framed me, and trust that I am strong enough to survive this while you do. Adrian's expression was absolutely controlled, but his eyes were devastated. I will not lose you. Then find the truth before they decide lies are enough. He left the interrogation room looking like a man walking toward war, and Cecilia sat alone with investigators who believed she was a murderer and had no reason to prove otherwise. The holding cell was small and cold and designed to break people who thought comfort was a right instead of a privilege. Cecilia sat on the narrow bench and stared at stone walls while hours blurred together. She was not afraid exactly, just exhausted by the weight of consequences finally arriving after months of accumulation. She had lied to Adrian to protect Eliza. That lie had created distance between them. The distance had made her look guilty when Victoria died, and now she was facing prosecution for murder she did not commit because she had spent too long controlling outcomes instead of trusting truth. It was almost poetic in its cruelty. The thing about being detained is that time stops meaning anything. Minutes feel like hours. Hours disappear into nothing. The only constant is stone walls and the knowledge that somewhere outside people are deciding your fate without your input. Cecilia understood now why Adrian had been so furious about her lying to him. Because this was what lack of control felt like. Helpless. Vulnerable. Dependent on other people's judgment with no ability to manage the outcome. It was terrifying. It was also strangely liberating. For the first time in her life, Cecilia could not manage or manipulate or disappear. She could only exist in truth and wait to see if truth was sufficient defense against fabricated evidence and London's appetite for scandal. She thought about Adrian hunting whoever had framed her, about Eliza alone at Ravensmore wondering if her family was disintegrating again, about her own family who had created this disaster through weakness and betrayal. And she realized something fundamental. She was not afraid of being convicted. She was afraid of dying without having truly lived, of spending 28 years invisible and then 6 months learning to be seen only to disappear permanently into scandal and false imprisonment. The cell door opened. A guard entered, followed by someone Cecilia had not expected to see. Edmund. Her brother looked worse than she had ever seen him, pale and shaking and carrying the weight of choices that had destroyed everyone around him. He stood in that cell doorway like a man facing execution. "What are you doing here?" Cecilia asked. "Telling the truth," Edmund replied. Finally. What Edmund confessed changed everything. He had not just participated in Victoria's conspiracy, he had been present when she died. The story came out in broken pieces. Victoria had summoned Edmund to her hotel room 3 days before her body was found. She was furious that Cecilia had negotiated her withdrawal from London, felt humiliated that her blackmail attempt had failed, wanted revenge against the Harrow family for ruining her carefully constructed scheme. She had demanded Edmund help her create new evidence against Adrian, forge additional documents, provide false testimony claiming the Duke of Ravensmore had threatened her life. Edmund had finally refused. For the first time in his weak, useless life, he had chosen not to participate in destroying someone else to save himself. Victoria had threatened him, had said she would expose everything about the original conspiracy, would ensure Edmund faced prosecution for perjury, would destroy what remained of the Harrow family's reputation. And Edmund had still refused, so Victoria had attacked him. The confrontation had turned physical. She had a letter opener. Edmund had defended himself. And in the struggle, Victoria had fallen against the corner of a marble table, hard enough to crack her skull. She died within minutes. Edmund panicked. He disposed of the body in the Thames. He cleaned the hotel room. He created the photographs placing Cecilia at the scene to deflect suspicion from himself. Then he spent 3 weeks living with the knowledge that he had killed someone and framed his own sister for the murder. Until the guilt became worse than the consequences. He confessed everything to investigators with Cecilia, sitting across from him in that interrogation room listening to her brother finally choose accountability over cowardice. When he finished, Thornton looked like someone had just dismantled his entire case with surgical precision. "You are confessing to manslaughter," the investigator said carefully. "I am confessing to causing Victoria Ashford's death and framing my sister for it," Edmund corrected. "Whatever you charge me with is what I deserve. Why confess now?" "Because Cecilia spent her entire life protecting me from consequences I earned," Edmund said quietly, "and I am done letting her sacrifice herself for my failures." He looked at her then, and Cecilia saw something she had never seen in her brother before. Genuine remorse. Not the performative guilt he displayed when caught, but real understanding of the damage he had caused and the choice to finally face it. "I am sorry," he whispered, "for everything, for the forgery, for the conspiracy, for letting you take the blame, for 28 years of being too weak to survive without you managing my disasters." Cecilia felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Why now?" "Because watching you refuse to manipulate your way out of this showed me what strength actually looks like," Edmund replied. "You could have lied, could have thrown me to investigators, could have used your connection to Adrian to obstruct justice. Instead, you chose truth even knowing it might destroy you. And I realized I had never chosen truth once in my entire life." The confession was devastating in its honesty. Thornton was already signaling guards to take Edmund into custody. The charges would be manslaughter at minimum, possibly murder depending on whether investigators believed the death was truly accidental. The evidence of framing Cecilia would add additional prosecution. Edmund would spend years in prison, but Cecilia would go free. Her brother had finally chosen to protect her by accepting consequences himself. It was the first selfless thing he had ever done, and it had cost him everything. Adrian was waiting when Cecilia walked out of the holding facility 6 hours later. He stood beside his carriage looking like he had aged a decade in the time she had been detained. When he saw her, he crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms with an intensity that felt like reclaiming something almost lost. They did not speak, just held each other while London moved around them, and Cecilia felt the weight of the past months finally breaking apart. The carriage ride back to Ravensmore was silent, not the hostile silence of distance, but the exhausted silence of 2 people who had survived something that should have destroyed them and were still processing whether survival was the same as victory. When they finally reached the estate, Adrian led her to the library where so many of their crucial conversations had happened. He poured whiskey for both of them without asking if she wanted it. They sat in chairs facing each other across 3 feet of space that felt like the distance between who they had been and who they needed to become. "Edmund confessed," Adrian said finally. "Yes, he is facing prosecution for manslaughter and obstruction." "Yes, you could have told investigators about his history. Could have made the case worse for him. Instead, you said nothing." "Because he finally chose accountability himself," Cecilia replied. "I was not going to take that choice away from him, even after he framed you for murder. Even then." Adrian took a drink and stared at her like she was something he was still learning to understand. "You're more forgiving than I am." "No," Cecilia said. "I am just tired of punishing people for being weak. Edmund will face legal consequences. That is sufficient. I do not need vengeance on top of justice." The distinction mattered, because it was the difference between what Adrian had wanted to do to her family and what Cecilia had chosen instead. He had wanted complete destruction. She had chosen measured accountability. Neither was wrong, but they revealed fundamentally different philosophies about how to survive damage. I would have destroyed him, Adrian admitted, if you had asked me to. I know. Why did you not? Because destruction is easy, Cecilia said quietly. Forgiveness is hard, and I am tired of choosing easy. They sat in silence while that truth settled between them. Then Adrian spoke again. I failed you. What? When you were detained, I could not protect you, could not manipulate the investigation, could not use my influence to extract you. I was completely powerless to save you. Yes, Cecilia agreed, and you told me to let it happen, to trust truth instead of trying to control the outcome. Yes, that was the most terrifying thing anyone has ever asked of me. Cecilia met his pale winter eyes and saw the devastation underneath his controlled expression. I know. That is what trust feels like. Terrifying and vulnerable and completely out of your control. I hated it. So did I, Cecilia said. When you asked me to trust you instead of managing outcomes. But that is what partnership requires. Choosing faith in each other over certainty of control. Adrian set down his glass very carefully. I do not know how to do that. Neither do I, Cecilia admitted. But we learn. The same way we learn everything else. By surviving storms. By surviving them together. He crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms again. This time the embrace was gentler but somehow more desperate, like he was holding something fragile that might shatter if he gripped too tightly. I thought I was going to lose you, he said quietly. You did not. But I could have, and that helplessness nearly destroyed me. Cecilia pulled back enough to see his face. Good. Adrian stared at her. Good. Yes, she replied, because now you understand what I felt when you asked me to trust you with information I thought would break you. That helpless terror of not being able to control whether someone you love survives. That is what I lived with for 6 weeks. The observation landed like a revelation. Adrian had been furious about her lying, about her lack of trust, about her assuming he needed protection. But he had never fully understood the fear that motivated those choices until he experienced that same helplessness himself. We are both terrible at this, he said finally. At what? At trusting, at vulnerability, at letting go of control long enough to actually love someone. Cecilia almost smiled. Yes, but at least we are terrible at it together. Is that enough? I do not know, she admitted, but it is honest, and honest is all we have. They stood together in that library while darkness gathered outside, and Cecilia understood they had finally reached something that resembled equilibrium. Not perfect, not easy, but balanced between two people learning to choose partnership over safety. Bochand. The scandal took weeks to settle. Edmund's confession created exactly the kind of gossip London loved. The weak aristocrat who finally found courage through destroying himself. The devoted sister who forgave even after being framed for murder. The ruthless duke who stood beside his wife instead of sacrificing her to protect his reputation. Every element was calculated to feed society's appetite for drama. But beneath the gossip, something fundamental had shifted. Cecilia was no longer invisible. She had been tested by false accusation and survived through truth instead of manipulation. Had chosen accountability over vengeance. Had demonstrated strength that did not require destroying others to prove itself. And London noticed. Invitations arrived at Ravensmore from families who had ignored her for 28 years. Political allies sought her counsel on matters they would have dismissed as beneath a duchess's concern. Women who had once whispered poison began asking for guidance. Cecilia had become exactly what Adrian said she would, someone impossible to ignore. But the real transformation happened inside Ravensmore itself. The house that had felt like a fortress designed to repel warmth slowly became something that resembled a home. Servants smiled openly. Music returned to corridors that had been silent for years. Eliza filled empty rooms with laughter and impossible questions, and Adrian learned slowly, painfully, to surrender control long enough to actually live instead of just surviving. It was not dramatic transformation, just small daily choices to trust instead of manage, to ask instead of assume, to be vulnerable instead of always being right. One evening, 3 months after Edmund's confession, Cecilia found Adrian standing on the cliffs where wind screamed and ocean crashed far below. She stood beside him without speaking. Finally, he broke the silence. I never thanked you. For what? for teaching me that strength is not the same as control. Cecilia looked out at the violent water. I did not teach you that. Edmund did, by finally choosing accountability over safety. Adrian considered this. Your brother destroyed himself to save you. Yes, that is the opposite of everything he has ever done. People change, Cecilia said quietly, when the cost of staying the same becomes worse than the pain of transformation. Is that what happened to us? I think so. We both spent years choosing safety over honesty. You through control, me through invisibility. And we kept choosing that until the cost became unbearable. And now we choose differently, Cecilia replied. Not perfectly, not easily, but consciously. Adrian reached for her hand. I am still learning. So am I. They stood together on those cliffs, and Cecilia finally understood what Ravensmore had needed all along. Not someone who could survive storms without breaking, but someone willing to break and rebuild instead of pretending damage did not exist. The ocean roared beneath them. The wind carried salt and ice and the promise of endless winter. But Ravensmore no longer felt cursed. It just felt like home. Years later, people would ask Cecilia what it was like being married to the most dangerous man in England. She would smile and say something diplomatic about partnership and mutual respect. But the truth was more complicated. Adrian never stopped being ruthless, never softened into someone comfortable or easy. He remained sharp and controlled and absolutely unforgiving when dealing with enemies who threatened what he protected. But he learned vulnerability, learned to ask instead of command, learned to trust instead of verify, learned that loving someone meant sometimes surrendering control even when surrender felt like drowning. And Cecilia never stopped being terrified of that vulnerability, never fully conquered the instinct to manage outcomes instead of trusting process, never completely believed she deserved to be chosen instead of useful. But she learned courage, learned to stay visible even when disappearing felt safer, learned to trust Adrian even when trust required faith she did not possess, learned that strength was not about never breaking, but about choosing to rebuild. Together they became something neither could have achieved alone. A partnership built on brutal honesty instead of comfortable lies. A marriage that survived because they chose truth even when truth was devastating. A family constructed from broken pieces that refused to stay shattered. Eliza grew into a young woman who understood that being chosen was more powerful than being perfect. She learned from watching Cecilia that visibility required courage. She learned from watching Adrian that strength required discipline. And she learned from watching both of them that love was not about finding someone who completed you, but about choosing someone you were willing to be broken beside. The girl who had been treated as a stain on aristocratic reputation became a woman who redefined what power looked like. Not domination, not control, but the courage to exist honestly in a world designed to reward performance. Edmund served 4 years for manslaughter before being released under conditions requiring permanent exile from London. He wrote to Cecilia once after his release, a single letter containing 2 sentences. I am learning to live with consequences. Thank you for teaching me that was possible. She never responded, not out of cruelty, but because some relationships are healthier at a distance. Some people need space to transform without the weight of old dynamics pulling them backward. And forgiveness did not require resuming connection. It just required releasing the need for vengeance. Cecilia's mother died 3 years after the scandal, alone and bitter and convinced to her final breath that her children had betrayed her by refusing to sacrifice themselves for family reputation. Cecilia attended the funeral because duty required it, but she felt nothing except quiet relief that she would never again have to manage her mother's crises or apologize for existing. Some deaths are not tragedies. Some are just conclusions to lives that should have chosen differently. On their 10th anniversary, Adrian took Cecilia back to the Harrow family ballroom where they had first met. The space looked smaller than she remembered, less grand. The chandeliers that had seemed magical at 18 just looked like expensive glass. The aristocrats who had once terrified her with their judgment now seemed like exactly what they were, performers playing roles written by someone else. They stood together in that ballroom, and Cecilia remembered being 28 years old and invisible beside dying white roses while everyone ignored her. Do you regret it? Adrian asked quietly. Regret what? Choosing me. Choosing visibility. Choosing all the chaos that came with refusing to disappear. Cecilia thought about the past decade, about the lies and betrayals and murder accusations, about learning to trust when trust felt impossible, about rebuilding a marriage from foundations cracked by deception, about becoming someone strong enough to be vulnerable. "No," she said finally. "I regret nothing except the time I wasted being invisible. Even the parts that nearly destroyed us. Especially those parts," Cecilia corrected, "because destruction is how we learned what we were actually made of." Adrian pulled her into his arms, and they danced slowly in that empty ballroom while ghosts of who they had been watched from shadows. The music was memory. The steps were history. But the connection was real and present and built on 10 years of choosing each other, even when choosing felt impossible. When the dance ended, Adrian spoke very quietly. "I love you." It was the first time he had said those exact words. In 10 years of marriage, he had shown her through action, through protection, through trust, through standing beside her when standing alone would have been easier. But he had never said the words. Cecilia looked at this man who had chosen her when she was invisible, who had demanded she become strong enough to match him, who had survived her lies and his fear and the terrible vulnerability of actually loving someone. "I know," she replied. "I have always known, but I needed to say it." "Why now?" "Because I finally understand what it means," Adrian said. "Love is not about possession or protection or control. It is about choosing someone and then choosing them again every day, even when choosing is hard, especially when choosing is hard." Yes. They stood together in that ballroom, and Cecilia finally understood the truth Adrian had been trying to teach her since that first conversation in the library. Strength was not about surviving alone. It was about choosing to survive together. The story should end there, with two broken people learning to be whole beside each other, with a house that learned to be a home, with a child who learned that being chosen mattered more than being perfect. But life is not a story with neat conclusions. It is an ongoing series of choices between safety and honesty, between control and trust, between the person you have always been and the person you are becoming. Adrian and Cecilia spent the rest of their lives making those choices. Sometimes they chose well. Sometimes they reverted to old patterns of control and invisibility before remembering they had promised themselves better. But they kept choosing, kept trusting even when trust felt impossible, kept being vulnerable even when vulnerability felt like drowning, kept building partnership even when retreating to safety seemed easier. And slowly the choices became less conscious. Trust became habit instead of decision. Vulnerability became default instead of exception. Partnership became identity instead of aspiration. They grew old together on those violent cliffs where storms battered ancient stone and ocean roared mindless warnings. They watched Eliza become formidable. They survived political enemies and social scandal and all the small betrayals that accumulate over decades of living. And they remained ruthlessly honest with each other. Not cruel, not harsh, just unwilling to let comfort become excuse for avoiding difficult truth. Because they had learned early that lies told in love's name were still lies, and lies eventually consumed everything they touched. Near the end, when Adrian was dying slowly from age and accumulated damage from years of carrying weight that should have crushed weaker men, Cecilia sat beside his bed in the room overlooking the cliffs. He looked at her with those pale eyes that had lost none of their intensity despite failing body. "Do you think we did it right?" he asked. "Did what right?" "This. Us, the life we built." Cecilia thought about 40 years of marriage, about all the ways they had wounded each other and healed, about mistakes made and forgiven, about choosing each other when choosing felt impossible. "No," she said honestly. "We did it messily. We hurt each other. We made terrible choices. We survived disasters that should have destroyed us. But we did it together," Cecilia finished, "and together was enough." Adrian smiled, and it was the expression she had learned to love over 4 decades. Still terrifying, still controlled, but with warmth underneath that only she ever got to see. "You were always stronger than you believed," he said quietly. "You were always more vulnerable than you admitted." Yes. They sat together while light faded and ocean crashed, and Cecilia held the hand of the man who had chosen her when she was invisible and demanded she become impossible to ignore. He died that night with her beside him. Not dramatically, not with final speeches or deathbed revelations, just quietly slipping from living to memory while storms battered stone and Cecilia refused to let go until breathing stopped completely. She did not cry, just sat with his body while dawn arrived and understood that some endings were not tragedies. Some were just conclusions to lives that had chosen well. Cecilia lived another decade after Adrian died. She managed Ravensmore with the same ruthless efficiency he had taught her. She protected Eliza's children the way Adrian had protected Eliza. She became the formidable Duchess London had always feared she would be once she stopped disappearing. And she never remarried, not because she could not love again, but because she had spent 40 years learning partnership with someone who demanded her absolute best, and she had no interest in settling for less. On her final day, she stood on the cliffs where she had stood with Adrian countless times before. The ocean still roared, the wind still screamed, the stones still held centuries of grief and triumph, and all the complicated human emotions that left marks on places. But Ravensmore no longer felt haunted. It felt like legacy, like proof that broken people could build something beautiful if they chose honesty over safety, like evidence that strength was not about never falling, but about choosing to rebuild, like testament that love was not about possession or protection or control, it was about choosing someone and then choosing them again. Every single day, even when choosing was terrifying, especially then. Cecilia looked out at the violent water and thought about the girl she had been at 28, invisible and scared and convinced her only value was in making herself smaller so others could feel larger. And she thought about the woman she had become, visible and scarred and absolutely certain that taking up space was not something to apologize for. The transformation had cost everything, had required destroying every comfortable lie she had built protection from, had demanded vulnerability that felt like standing on cliff edges with nothing but faith to prevent falling, had forced her to choose truth even when truth felt like drowning. But the cost had been worth it, because invisibility was lonelier than any storm, and she had spent the last 50 years refusing to disappear. She died that night in her sleep with the sound of ocean and wind and all the wild, beautiful violence of a house that had learned to be a home. And when morning came, the servants found her with a smile on her face, like she had finally finished something that mattered. The ruthless Duke of Ravensmore and the invisible daughter, who became unforgettable, were buried together on the cliffs overlooking the sea. Not because they needed monuments, but because some stories deserve to be remembered. Not as fairy tales with easy morals, but as complicated, messy human truth about two broken people who learned that strength was not about surviving alone. It was about choosing to survive together, even when together felt impossible, especially then. And that choice changed everything.